How powerful is destiny? Can people overcome it? Can they choose what paths they pursue in life? Or can they merely determine how quickly they pursue said paths? What can be said about Phantom, Requiem for Phantom? Well, it's certainly a thing, and a twisted creation at that. It definitely reminded me to rewatch Obane Renmai, and left me questioning a lot of things. Look everyone, I'll get straight to the point on this retrospective. Phantom, Requiem for Phantom, is extremely fascinating, and extremely weird, and often extremely intentionally uncomfortable. And writing this intro 30 minutes after having finished it, I'm still, as the youth say, shook. I also want to say that, in my opinion, Phantom is probably the most disturbing thing I've watched in this channel, except maybe Technolize, but oddly enough that one sat better with me. So if you're a fan of the show, please note that me stating this is not a complaint. I think that Requiem for Phantom is supposed to be disturbing, shocking, and grim, and in fact I consider it something of a shock piece, whether intentionally or not, and it delivers on those things, and so for that reason I would consider fascinating and successful, in that it definitely achieves what I'm assuming it wanted to. It achieves the goals of becoming some sort of grand, tragic, operatic production, and I also happen to think that's why it gets to me so much, because its extremely visceral and open display of abuse in many forms, as well as many other unsettling topics, make it the kind of thing where I did have to pause mid-episode or something to decompress at points. It's one of the very few series that's required me to do that, and it and the tone of this video will just not be the brightest because of the nature of the show. That's not to say I think the show's a waste of time, or shouldn't be watched if you want to watch something bizarrely grim and interesting for that reason. It's just to say that this will not be the brightest production, and that the production of Phantom itself, it's not a feel-good watch, and it never sought out to be. Just a quick caveat. Now, I wasn't expecting to watch another crime anime literally right after making the Gungrave video, but while I would consider Gungrave to be a relatively archetypal, safe, accessible, and interesting mafia story, something which, although a little by the book, does it very well, Requiem for Phantom is a mafia fever dream that transcends itself and kind of its own genre to invoke an odd mixture of viewer empathy, interest, unease, and philosophical questioning. Its characters are all extremely damaged, its plot feels borderline incoherent, taking sudden 90-degree turns, by design, its subject matter is often extremely grim and disturbing, and its tone borders on nihilistic at times. And yet all of this feels mostly thought out and well executed. It's something that wants to be grandiose, hypes itself up as such, and then zooms into the main characters to the point where we forget all of this, and then, just as everything wraps up, pulls back the camera at the perfect moment to let us see how the intense emotional development of the characters meshes with the grand story at play. And somehow it executes all of this incredibly well. As viewers, we never get the full story or lore of the world here, but that's kind of the point, seeing as this is a story about individuals crushed by the mass of the organizations that oppose them and enslave them. For this reason, I think it's actually fitting that we as viewers don't know everything or really much of anything. I would say it's unique, and I would say that it's memorable. If Gungrave is a good intro to crime anime, Phantom, as I will refer to it now, is like the advanced reading, extending into conversations about the point of life, the nature of destiny, the nature of human agency, and the at times extreme tragic nature and unfair nature of life itself. Other than possibly Technolize, it's probably the most depressing and disturbing piece I've ever covered on this channel, trigger warning, and it's definitely not the easiest watch. Now there is of course a sleek action veneer over all of this, but at its core Phantom tells the story of trapped pawns attempting to fight for their freedom, only for this fight to get themselves killed. Spoilers. However, while this may sound like a rather nihilistic assessment of Phantom, the story itself does have a surprising amount of character developments, character triumphs, character explorations, as well as just general psychological exploration and substance, cementing Requiem as for Phantom as a piece that's more of a psychological thriller and exploration to me than just a typical crime anime. It becomes the sort of grandiose opera piece it hypes itself up to emulate, as even alluded to in Universe, whose scale is only magnified by how much time is spent closely mulling over Renji, Eren's, and Cal's mental state. And it always feels over the top in a bizarrely subdued way. Yes, there is the expected over-the-top gun battles, but on a more metaphysical level, there's always a sort of strong tension boiling just under the surface in every single scene, and the fact that we very rarely see this in its entirety makes us always feel on edge. It's often rather disturbing, tragic, uncomfortable, and dare I say unpleasant, But it's also well-made, intriguing, intellectual, and philosophical, and all of this seems to be some kind of point. It wants to be a grand tragedy, and it is. For this reason, this is not a Rosafon situation where I don't know how to feel. No, instead I feel just as I imagine the producers intended me to. Awestruck, shocked, and uneasy. It's something that requires you to decompress after having watching it, but that also means it wasn't intense, and perhaps even as grand as it sought out to be. For this reason, while this intro may sound negative, it's not intended to be. It's just a note that not every artistic endeavor has a happy story, ending, or tone. Indeed, some do not seek this by design, like Phantom. And while Phantom is not a happy piece, it is a memorable one, and the topic of today's video. Getting to some brief context of the series, even the origins of this series are a tad discomforting. Like Gungrave, Phantom is a sort of spin-off of a video game. Unlike Gungrave, though, the game that this was based off of was, and I'm quoting Wikipedia here, I have no idea if this is true or not, an adult visual novel. I don't exactly know what that means or how true this is, and I have no interest in looking into it, I will not. But with this source material, the original Phantom OVA came out in 2004. That OVA will not be mentioned after this point. Jump to 2009, and Studio B-Train, a subsidy of Studio IG, and a studio team known for its works like Noir and working with the concept of girls with guns, endeavor to make one more, that being Requiem for Phantom. In fact, it would be their last Girls with Guns work, and one of their last works ever, as the studio went cold after 2012 with the retirement of founder Koichi Mashimo. In this way, even on a meta level, Phantom feels as a piece that's oddly lonely and isolated in the cold. With all of this in mind, let's conduct a brief plot overview to get familiar with the story and set up closer looks into its characters and themes. Now, this plot overview will contain the caveats of all the other retrospective plot overviews. I only intend for it to cover the bare minimum of the plot, enough to get a rough outline where characters fit into everything. For character-specific developments, please consult their own specific sections, and please forgive any skipped details. Now, Requiem for Phantom follows Reiji Azuma, also known as Zwei at times. While visiting America as a tourist, he accidentally witnesses the murder of a reporter, a murder by a mysterious assassin, the Phantom. He then must run for his life, as the assassin is under orders to leave no witnesses. After a lengthy game of cat and mouse, he is found and is almost killed by the assassin. While she is about to kill him, a creepy man, Scythe Master, walks out from the shadows and claims to see potential in Reiji, deciding instead to take him to the secret desert compound. Now, this secret compound in the middle of the desert is where Reiji is given a choice. He can either train under the assassin that tried to kill him, a young woman named Ein, later Eren, to become like her, or he can just die. After enduring some brutal training and being forced to kill someone he's never met, he eventually chooses life and is conscripted into Inferno, a mega mafia type organization seeking to control all organized crime in the world. Now a professional hitman, he works alongside the extremely repressed and distant Ein, and seeks to help her regain her humanity out of his own compassionate humanity. While working for Inferno, Scythe's boss Claudia McCoonan also enters the picture and tries to claim Reiji for herself, going so far as to give him his actual passport to try and sway him. This brings back his former memories, although he realizes that with all the killing and blood on his hands, he can't just return home, as he's now permanently changed. While Claudia does all of this, Ein is sent out to spoil a drug deal set up by Claudia. It is said that Scythe betrayed Inferno and is now on the run. Ein ends up fighting Claudia's forces and escapes with a bullet in her. Meanwhile, Reiji, now aware of who he was and more determined than ever to help Ein remember who she was, rushes out to the desert safe house, figuring that she would be there after a Scythe Master apparently abandoned her. He then saves her life, and resolves that the two should run away together. Now, two very important things happen while Reiji and Eren are on the run. First off, they come to this hotel and there is a very sentimental moment where Reiji has to talk Eren out from ending her own life. With her departure from Inferno, she feels lost, as while that has been a constant source of abuse for her, it's also been the only thing that's ever given her guidance up until this point. And now feeling lost, she doesn't know what to do with her life. Luckily though, Reiji resolves this by telling her that they can figure it out, and that she's stronger than she thinks. And he also bestows upon her the name Eren, to confirm that she does have individuality, and doesn't need a past, a fact that he also backs up when he rips up his own passport in front of her, proving that the past is not everything. While this scene in the hotel bathroom is rather small, it's only a few minutes, it is critical for Eren's development, and a critical turning point in her character, as while she doesn't completely turn away from her abuser yet, she has started to learn that she is capable of individuality and individual agency. What follows is a brief escapade, literally like 2 episodes, that only lasts until Scythe Master manipulates Eren into rejoining him, and Reiji is captured and convinced by Claudia to kill Scythe to prove his loyalty to Inferno. This results in a confrontation on the docks, where Reiji is about to succeed in taking Scythe Master's life, only for Eren to block the shot intended for him and fall into the water. Devastated, Reiji is then shot by Scythe himself, who escapes into the night. One recap episode and 6 months later, it's then revealed that Reiji somehow survived and is now the new Phantom. He works under Claudia now and is critical to her plans to help the Yakuza family, the Gotos, enter Inferno. She wants to do this so that she will have powerful backers in the organization to back her own inter-organizational schemes. These plans quickly go awry though, when it's obvious that someone is out to kill the Goto men, and, in the process, kills an innocent bystander. Now that innocent bystander is the sister of Cal Devon, who Reiji runs into while investigating the Goto murders. Cal, a young and very distraught girl, then urges Reiji to get revenge for her fallen sister. Feeling bad for her, a runaway, and understanding her urge for revenge, Reiji then agrees to assist Cal by allowing her to come on as his quote-unquote assisted. Now he calls her his assistant because an extremely suspicious and dangerous Inferno only allows her to live with Reiji because Reiji tells them that he wants to train Cal as a new assassin. He of course doesn't and is extremely uncomfortable with creating someone else like him, but knowing that she would be killed otherwise, he allows Cal to tag along in this role. The two then become very close, like siblings, going on several quests and bonding. Stuff happens, and then Claudia uses another attempt on the Goto's life as an excuse to execute her competitor, Isaac. The real assassin turns out, however, to be Eren, who somehow survived and is still working under Scythe Master. Said Scythe had been manipulating events so far, including the Gotos, in order to get revenge on Claudia and work his way back into Inferno. This is because she was actually the traitor from the drug deal years ago, and purposely botched it in order to dispose of Scythe Master and hook the Gotos up with a shit ton of cocaine. With all of this revealed, Inferno forces Claudia's best friend Lizzie to kill her. Yeah, this main character just unceremoniously dies, and then goes after Reiji and Cal. Reiji narrowly escapes the Goto/Inferno setup after Eren kills most of the Goto men, and returns home only to see it explode. Distraught over Cal's apparent apartment death, Reiji then runs, and Inferno sends Eren to kill him. She does find him, but fails when she remembered his promise to help her live again, and the two run off to Mexico. Meanwhile, at the apartment, a crying Cal is approached by Scythe Master. You see, she wasn't in the explosion, but instead at the VCR store. Cut to 2 years later, and Eren and Reiji, posing as twins, are now living in a small Japanese town. They live a quiet life and hope to remain left alone. Inferno has work in the town though, as the Gotos have establishments there, and Cal, now the new Phantom, tags along. Yes, this character is supposedly the same as this character after only 2 years. Anyways, feeling Reiji left her for dead, which I guess he kind of did when we think about it, Cal seeks to kill Eren in order to make Reiji suffer, and seeks his pain above all else. Reiji then attempts to get close to Mio, the secret daughter of the Goto boss, in order to blackmail Inferno to leave them alone. This fails though when Cal kidnaps Mio just to get her out of the way and sets up a duel with Eren. She succeeds in contacting Eren and setting up her duel, however, right before she does, Mio shows compassion for Cal, and this makes her question her whole revenge quest, especially after having killed Lizzie. Realizing that she's basically stuck on this path though, Cal decides to proceed with the deal and meets Eren up at the agreed spot inside and outside of this church. However, instead of finding just Eren, she finds Reiji and Eren. Eren takes up a spot outside the church to prevent outside interference from the Gotos, while Reiji resolves that he needs to put Cal down once and for all in order to help her find some kind of peace and resolve the mistake he made so long ago. He succeeds, and Cal finally finds some kind of peace in her passing, apologizing for being so hateful and so violent. Meanwhile, outside, Eren takes out the Goto guys and is confronted by Scythe Master, with his new 6 brainwashed killers, all brainwashed and constructed using techniques pioneered on Eren, Reiji, and Cal. Eren and Reiji then put them down, and Eren goes on to kill Scythe Master, after an inspiring monologue where she resolves that his attempts to manipulate her will no longer succeed, and that she's finally rediscovered that she is her own person, with her own identity and her own soul. It's a beautiful scene, really. Cut to 6 months later, Eren and Reiji are now in Mongolia, having finally figured out Eren's origins and having finally returned to the village which she grew up in. The sight of the sky finally allows her memories to return to her, and she finally smiles for real as she's discovered what her home really was. She and Reiji are finally happy here, and Reiji is glad to have kept his promise of helping Eren live again and feel human again. And then Reiji gets killed by an unseen assassin, and Ayn is implied to off herself by eating a poisonous plant in the literal last 55 seconds of the series. What the fuck? Okay, so, as expected, the ending for Requiem for Phantom is a textbook example which makes you ask, well, what did I just watch? What just happened? And did we really need to kill these two guys? Like, I honestly don't care for it, and consider it one of the worst aspects of the series. Now I get it, it is in line with the grandiose, tragic nature of the series, but I thought there was going to be a pleasant twist for once, and I was on board with these guys getting their happy ending. This is a nitpick on my part, this is a personal taste issue, and I understand what they were going for. It's just something I don't personally care for, but if you like it, I understand. It's just not an ending for me. Instead, I do the same thing I do with Conqueror of Shambhala, where I just pause the thing 3 minutes before credits, before it actually ends, tell myself that this is the final frame, this is the actual ending, and turn the video off. I won't say it's bad, it's fitting enough, but the execution just seems a bit sudden and mean-spirited to me. Like, don't let us get all the way to Mongolia just to kill them anyways. Either have them die as heroes in the final battle, or just let them have the happy ending where they get away. This weird hybrid ending does feel mean-spirited and like a middle finger to me, personally. Again, I understand if you don't mind it, but I do. And oddly enough, it reminds me of the ending to The Sopranos. If you know, you know. It just feels a little over-the-top, mean-spirited, and or edgy. But then again, the entirety of Requiem of Phantom is something that's supposed to make you feel that way, and it's supposed to make you feel squeamish, so on at least some kind of logical level, this does fit pretty well with my eyes, even if I personally don't like it. Phantom is the kind of piece that makes you want to decompress afterwards and think of less depressing things after watching. Its at times rather nihilistic tone and ending make it one of those shows where the ending is so much of an oof that it makes you feel okay with just turning off the computer and walking your dog or something. I mean, I do have a greater appreciation of my mundane life now, seeing as how messed up life can be, at least as it was portrayed in this show. That being said, all of the above mentioned points are by design, and it does execute on its design fairly well, on the grand scale that it seeks to emulate, and the motifs of opera proclaimed by the characters in and out of universe add to this. It seems to be pretty self-aware and have self-aware admissions of, this is going to be over the top, and this is edge, and it rolls along with those concepts. As a whole, the plot feels rather disjointed, with hard twists, pivots, dropped plot points, and randomly disappearing characters, but it mostly works because this feeling of everything falling apart as we watch it is by design and in line with the tone of the show. They work surprisingly well, considering that the characters are the main focus here, and that the series goes to painful lengths to avoid any kind of status quo. It has a lot of genuine twists and surprises. Overall, Requiem for Phantom and its ending feel exactly like what I imagine it set out to. Unpleasant and at times disturbing, featuring unfortunate characters dealing with, and to some extent, escaping their unfortunate fates. I won't say it's the most enjoyable, it's not. It is on, if not past, technolized levels of discomfort for me, but that doesn't mean it doesn't have artistic merit or vision. It's instead a tragic, and perhaps somewhat nihilistic piece, lamenting lost innocence, and yet to some extent, celebrating the limited achievements that Reiji, Eren, and Cal still manage to achieve in an atmosphere where they are afforded almost no agency. I'm not going to say that it's trash, and I'm not going to say it doesn't have substance, and I'm not going to say it's not worth your time if you like it. None of these statements would be true, and in fact, I do find it incredibly interesting. I do, however, just want you to be aware that this is not what I would consider a feel-good piece with a feel-good ending. It is, in its entirety, a tragedy. Further discussing the plot structure as a whole, Requiem for Phantom is one of the most unusual and uneven plot structures I've ever seen. For the better. Even if everything happens in chronological order, the plot doesn't really feel linear because it never settles on a specific direction. Yes, it does focus on Reiji, but the constant changes in the circumstances surrounding him means that there is no status quo for more than at most 3 or 4 episodes at a time. Phantom loves hard plot pivots, and how these are paced and delivered accentuates them and makes the plot feel rather fast-paced and impactful. While it's not the most balanced and does have some logical or storytelling holes every now and again, it comes at us so fast that we don't really have time to ponder or dissect any of these. Yes, if we do zoom out, it's rather obvious that there are a few plot holes and storytelling issues here and there. However, the way the storytelling is executed is in such a way that we are rarely afforded the time to zoom out and truly notice these things. And yet, it does not feel rushed. It just feels fast-paced. There are quite a few time skips, and there are a lot of hard plot pivots, but they feel natural enough and extremely fitting, considering that one of the core ideas of the series is the idea that Reiji, Eren, and Cal lack agency. With this idea in mind, it makes sense that the plot is kind of all over the place because they don't really have too much impact on it. For example, in the span of 3 episodes, 16 to 18, we go from Claudia and Reiji seemingly loyally pursuing Inferno's agenda against the traitorous Scythe Master, all the while Reiji endeavors to redeem himself and Cal, to, in episode 18, learning that Claudia was the traitor and Reiji running away with Eren to Mexico because he thinks Cal died in this frame right here. Hard pivots like this are kind of the bread and butter of the plot structure of Phantom, and all of these 90-degree turns upend any kind of status quo that we may think that we're nearing. Plot pivots so hard and so often that I would argue pivots like this mean that the story has no status quo in fact, unless you consider the idea that Reiji is constantly getting screwed over. There are many hard plot pivots and they never allow the show to settle. It never gets into a groove of sorts, and as such always feels like anything could happen, and that Reiji, Eren, and Cal are truly just pawns swamped by the circumstances around them. And while this does mean that the story can be a little all over the place, this all feels by design and extremely fitting. In fact, Phantom's employment of such a disjointed plot is one of the aspects reinforcing the cast's lack of agency the most. They are often simply swept up by events out of their control in a way that makes logical sense, even if the surrounding circumstances may not make the most logical sense. This makes the viewing experience of Phantom oddly surreal and uneasy, as it displays that it's never afraid to just completely avoid and or reset any kind of expected status quo, something that it does multiple times. It lets us know that no one and nothing is sacred, and that it will always be a wild ride. From episode 1, we think this will be about Eren and Reiji working together and perhaps bonding. Then we think it'll be about them running away and escaping and finding their identities. Then we think it will be about them fighting to the death. Then we think it will be about Reiji and Cal learning from Eren's death and escaping Inferno together. Then we realize that Eren never died and that she, I guess, is gonna fight Reiji again. Then we learn that Reiji and Eren are living in Japan. And then we think it will be about them fighting Cal, only to see them kill Scythe Master, and then we think we're gonna get a happy ending and everyone just dies in Mongolia. Phantom always keeps you guessing, and I think that's one of the core charms of the plot design. And while it may sound hard to follow or incoherent, the amazing thing is that it's not. It still feels rather sensical, and even though it feels like it doesn't look before leaping, the execution here makes it pretty obvious that the production team for the most part did. I've seen poorly thought out plots and poorly constructed plots, and this doesn't feel like one. Instead, it just feels like one that goes out of its way to shake things up, which it does very well, really reinforcing the cast's lack of agency in a very visceral and literal storytelling way. Something else rather visceral about Phantom are its settings and visuals. Starting with the former, Phantom is one of those pieces that's set in the real world, and it does a decent job with that. Look, I'm not gonna say that I can logically see 100% of what happens here going down the way it does in the real world, and the settings themselves, while seeming real enough, are a little vague. There's no crazy locations or such to interrupt my suspension of disbelief, although it's clear that this anime's America may not be the most detailed or lore accurate, aside from Las Vegas. In fact, there is this kind of unintentionally humorous undertone of characters questioning what's wrong with those Americans, even though I think canonically only Cal, Claudia, and Lizzie are actually Americans. Getting back on topic, the settings here feel kind of generic from the quote American angle, aside from Las Vegas. Like, yeah, this is supposed to be LA or San Francisco, I don't remember, and Philadelphia makes a cameo here, and I can see streets or street corners like this being in any of those cities, but that's only because they're kind of generic buildings and blocks. Every city here feels a little generic, and like it could be anywhere, really, aside from Las Vegas. However, this aspect of setting design does work better on a smaller level. While the setting and apartments of Phantom often feel cramped and dirty and sad, something that happens all around the world, these elements do a good job of humanizing the cast and displaying how dehumanized they start off as. Reiji, Eren, and Cal are all seen as pawns, barely above animals, and so it's fitting that they spend a lot of time in what can be acquainted to as simply cages for human beings, be it the desert hideout, their small cramped apartment hideouts, or a few hotels. Even at the peak of Reiji's influence and power in Inferno, he still lives in this dingy apartment being shunted around like livestock. Until he and Eren get to Japan, it never feels like they have a home, and that they are truly, as Eren puts it, ghosts with nowhere to haunt. While this means that the settings kind of blend into each other, I would argue that this is probably by design, as even the physical aspects of the characters' worlds start to blend into the haze they call a life. Focusing on these settings themselves for a moment, we have West Coast safe house, desert safe house, Japanese apartment, and smaller appearances by Claudia's mansion, some Inferno headquarters, and a few other places. And each of these does do a decent job of establishing their characters. For example, when we first get to know Eren in the desert warehouse, its barren, abandoned, and bleak nature mirror her emotional state. When we first get to know Reiji in the West Coast safe house, we see it kind of mirrors how he tries to establish a veneer of normality and humanity, further reinforced by Cal's entry to it. Claudia's mansion establishes her wealth and power, and with her fall, is destroyed along with her. And finally, the limited views we are afforded into Inferno's headquarters let us see their power, and their limited presence reinforces how far the main cast is from that actual power. Good settings not only establish some world building, but also have design elements tying into the themes and characters of the production. And they certainly do here, because they're not the most memorable ones. Everything feels ephemeral by design, even the tone. The tone for Requiem for Phantom is one of its most defining aspects, and why I would consider it to be a rather glum piece. I know I like to look for the positive in things. I think that's obvious with my coverage of a lot of things on this channel, and I think that a series or its tone may not often be as dark as expected, especially when looking at pieces famed for such dark tones, like Ergo Proxy or Technolize, for example. But here, I think it might actually be. The tone here often feels dreary, imposing, tense, creepy, uncomfortable, and nihilistic. And while there are bright spots, of course, especially when the characters resolve to rediscover their humanity and do accomplish some things, overall, the tone is quite dark, and the prevailing nihilism doesn't let up even at the end, as even when we think we're about to get a happy ending, this is torn away in the final minute, and the show says, well, that happened. I've said it before, and I'll say it again, this is not a fun piece. Its tone is often soul-crushing and dark, often never presenting characters with opt-outs, or taking those away unexpectedly. While one could argue that this makes it a rather realistic piece, I'm not going to say that I watch anime for its realism. I understand that this may make the series more interesting to some, but for me, I did find it a little depressing, even by the standards of shows where everyone dies at the end. Gungrave and even Technolize in comparison are nowhere near as bleak in my eyes. To some extent, I do question how intentional all of this is though. On one hand, it does feel rather intentional, especially when we consider the ending and rather operatic nature aimed for. But it also feels a little unintentional because I question if the series actually wants to feel openly hostile at times. It does every now and again, and it goes to the point where this even sabotages character arcs in my eyes. Phantom doesn't feel edgy in the generic cringe way something trying way too hard to be cool feels, but genuinely nihilistic at times. I wouldn't go so far as to say that Phantom has contempt for its audience, I don't think it does, but it certainly feels like it has contempt for its characters, and perhaps even itself. I don't know how much of this arises from trying to create some kind of epic tragedy, and how much of it spawns from that peak 2000s edge, but it feels like an odd blend of both here, and it doesn't sit the best with me. I even find it detrimental to the presentation of Reiji, Eren, and Cal's character arcs. Like, Reiji, Eren, and Cal really do have some impressive arcs, and really do some impressive things when it comes to rediscovering their humanity, even finding peace in their deaths. And yet, if the tone of the show is constantly nothing matters, then it makes it feel like all of this meaningful character growth is pointless. And while you could make some kind of argument saying that it technically is because they died, I don't like the idea that character growth is pointless because someone died, because realistically we're all gonna die, and that doesn't validate the idea that we shouldn't grow or try to be better people. As such, I find that the tone here covers up and even denies a lot of the solid character growth and character development, making the ending feel even more spiteful. This, of course, is somewhat subjective, but I think it's fair to say that the nihilistic bite of the series is prevalent, and the creators were not afraid to show it off. Some may find this and the suffering of the cast to be endearing, morbidly fascinating if not. Some may cry and be shocked by how much emotion it can be elicited. Some may think that the tragedy of it all is executed excellently, and I personally think that while this is something of the inspiring tragedy it sought out to be, the tone is detrimental to this at times. Like, look, I know it's cliche, but couldn't we just let them live a happy life in Mongolia? Like, if you wanted to kill them, just have them die in the final battle, not this off-screen crap. Rants aside, I think it's obvious I don't care for the tone or the ending here, and they kind of exude the same nihilistic energy as a whole. But I will also say that this is very much a personal nitpick, and not what I would consider a key flaw of the series. It's not going to bother everyone, and it's something that the series definitely set out to do and nailed to a big degree, and it definitely sets the series apart, even if it's not my personal cup of tea. Getting to the actual production aspects of Phantom, Requiem for Phantom is cleanly animated and often hosts some great fight choreography. They did a great job making a lot of the violence feel plausible while giving it enough action flair to be eye-catching. They go to especially great pains with all of the knife fighting scenes, which are gorgeous. Look at the light shimmer off Eren's blade, look how it flashes as it flies through the night air, and tell me that they didn't put work into this. It's legitimately mesmerizing. Complementing all of this is a great use of lighting and shadows, especially for a lot of the night scenes. Focusing on lighting in particular, Phantom makes excellent use of shadows and lighting angles to enhance the atmosphere, mystery, and action of many of its shots, with long shadows and dim lighting putting us further on edge and further foreshadowing the grim events to come. Its digital animation and execution is overall pretty good, and it's a great example of the polish possible in the late 2000s, and in spite of its often disturbing visuals, the visuals as a whole are presented well on a technical level. Now I note the previous point, because while the animation itself is well done, Phantom contains a ton of very creepy, uncomfortable, and disturbing visual work, especially concerning Scythe Master and Eren. As a show with a prominent theme of abuse and the impact of abuse, as well as a lot of uncomfortable adjacent topics that I don't think YouTube would want me to discuss, Phantom leans into this with a ton of creepy, uncomfortable shots meant to dehumanize and objectify the cast, especially Eren. A lot of the scenes with her and Scythe Master are genuinely skin-crawling, and I'm assuming that's the point, as it's part of this being a shock piece of some sorts. And, well, it makes extremely effective at that and creating some stomach-turning moments and shots. As for the not-so-disturbing scenes and animation as a whole, the only quirk that I blatantly noticed was the use of CGI for some of the vehicle stuff. It wasn't immersion breaking, and most of it's done well, it's just that my brain picks up on these things. Other than that, the only real production quirk I noticed was that 7.69% of the series consists of filler recap episodes. That's right, 2 out of 26 episodes here are near-complete rehashes of previous ones consisting of recycled footage. While the classic recap episode is something mostly dead nowadays, as far as I know, I don't watch modern stuff, it is something of a fixture in older, longer series. Sometimes the production team just needed to stall for time, and a recap episode at the end of an arc was an easy way to stall for time and perhaps consolidate the story for viewers. But was that needed here? One of the charms of the smaller 26 episode format we see a lot of on this channel is its lack of filler, and the small format would allow series to just not bother with the final few episodes if they didn't need to. For example, Technolize and Ergo Proxy are only 22 and 23 episodes respectively. And so I ask, why not just settle for 24 episodes here? It's not a big issue here, you of course can skip the recap episodes, but even with so many hard plot pivots, the plot is not hard to follow. So I wonder, does this elude the production difficulties, or just some kind of contractually obligated episode count? I don't know. It's not really a nitpick of mine, but it is interesting. Something I don't wonder about though is the quality of the OST. The original soundtrack is great. It's a mixture of pseudo-religious choir work, moving string pieces, hip-hop inspired beats, and faster action pieces. While not super uniform, neither is the plot of the series, so the variety on display here often meshes very well with their accompanying scenes. For example, the sullen and pseudo-religious work reinforces the gravity and dehumanization of a lot of the character situations we see. The upbeat action pieces fit well with their over-the-top action scenes, and everything, of course, always enhances their respective atmosphere and settings. One of the best examples of OST work here, though, is the evolution of Cal's theme. At first, it's this little lullaby from her prized pocket watch that Reiji bought her. It's innocent, reserved, and peaceful. And then after the time skipped and her manipulation by Scythe Master, and as her hatred of Reiji grows, a variant of Cal's theme is now used when she's on screen. It's now a more fast-paced, unstable, and violent rendition of it. And yet she still uses the pocket watch Reiji gives her in-universe, which allows us to hear the original of the theme here and there, and allows us to see how it contrasts with the new version. This is brilliant, as it establishes not only Cal's unstable evolution, but also the shards of trust and innocence that she desperately yearns to hold onto, all the while establishing that these are connected to Reiji because he's the one that bought her that pocket watch, beautifully symbolizing their relationship. Overall, the application of the OST is great, and it is of course helped by the fact that every single song is performed well and recorded well. I also found it very funny that the opening vocals of the first intro to the series remind me of a song from Haibane Renmi, which I would definitely recommend watching after this to cleanse the palate. And overall, the OST feels as though it lends a sensitive touch that most of the series refutes and lacks at times. I also want to comment on this fun little Easter egg while Reiji and Eren are on the run for the first time, where they listen to the opening of the series on the radio. I love these little fourth wall moments where characters listen to the OST in universe, and this is a neat example of that. Even tying into some of the story elements, as the opening is in Japanese, and Reiji is Japanese, which leads Eren to question him what it's like to have a home, or to know what his home is like. Something which gnaws on her mind, since her memories are erased, and she doesn't know where she's from, or what it's like to know where she's from. Just a neat little moment where they have an Easter egg, and even tie that into some of the themes and ideas in the story itself. Now, the term operatic has been tossed out several times throughout the course of this video, and I'd like to briefly touch on that. While Requiem for Phantom is obviously not an opera, no one sings anything at any point, it is something which obviously shows some interest in the ideas of the medium. If I had to guess, someone working on this loved the scale and image of opera, and thought how to weave it into the series without actually making it into one. This is not a criticism though, as when I think of opera, my limited viewings on YouTube imbued 3 ideas to me. 1. Opera is something which really loves its scale and atmosphere. It tries to be grandiose, and relishes in how artificial or bizarrely enchanting it may feel. 2. The execution of any competent opera requires a high amount of effort in many fields and a lot of skills required to do this. And 3. The combination of the first 2 mean that opera has a bizarrely strong and unique artistic feel and integrity to it. It hits different, for lack of a better terms. Now, full disclaimer, I've never been to an opera in real life, though as someone who watched a few random clips on YouTube and was rather enthralled by them, I must say that I find the scale and of the talent needed for such things to be mesmerizing. Opera, from my brief research, requires an expertise in not only singing, but also in linguistics, acting, and many other fields associated with a production. It seems like something for which an immense amount of effort must be placed in for anything nearing competent execution. No microphones are used, there's no vocal translation if something's written in another language, something very possible here, and there's no pre-recorded music, just artistic execution. An immense amount of effort also means that opera, from what I saw, also tends to feel extremely organic. Now, I'm not going to say that the plot of The Magic Flute is more realistic than Hairspray. It's not. But it does feel more grandiose, and therefore organic in its own bizarre kind of way. And I think someone working on Phantom must have realized all of these things and saw the parallels between the emotional and often bizarre plots that operas can have, and embarked to use various operatic motifs to kind of embellish the storytelling beats in the story and give them their own flair. Now, this doesn't manifest in anyone singing, but instead in a self-aware grandiosity and the commitment to an extremely emotional story punctuated by twists, turns, and tragedies, all the while relishing in its own self-proclaimed scale. To its credit though, while Requiem for Phantom has no singing, a lot of the instrumental works in the OST also have obvious operatic inspirations, especially in their use of strings and vocals. And it's obvious that the inspirations of opera as a medium are pretty well woven into the final product and help set it apart. Now I just wonder what an actual opera of this would look like. Getting to some quick notes on the dub, it's also very good, and it's one of the few pieces where almost all of the swearing actually feels pretty natural. I don't mind some swearing in pieces, but there's a pretty thick line between natural amounts and excessive amounts meant to generate edge. However, with how dark and intense Phantom often is, all the swearing here feels pretty natural. And as for the cast itself, they also feel pretty natural and did a great job voicing everyone here. Colleen Clinkenbeard gives Claudia the deep femme fatale voice that you would expect from a woman attempting to manipulate everyone for her own goals, and perfectly encapsulates both her sinister nature and twisted idealistic ideology that somehow almost sounds justified when coming out of her voice. I also really like Shay Moore's portrayal as Lizzie, as it feels like the most genuine portrayal of the series, as Lizzie is the quote-unquote most normal person here, and it always feels reassuring for that reason. Whether she's upset, happy, or distraught, it's always nice just hearing someone still capable of actual emotion and humanity processing these things, and so Moore's performance brings a lot of great vocal reassurance to her scenes. It's also a rather wide performance, with Lizzie running an emotional gamut of sorts, and establishes her vocal acting skills. Brittany Karbowski's performance as Cal also runs an emotional gambit, and likewise deserves respect for just how well it executes upon this. Although Kent Williams' performance as Scythe Master doesn't run the emotional gamut, seeing Scythe doesn't have emotions, he nails the cold evil in his delivery needed for such a character. For context, this is the same guy who voiced Father in Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood, so if you're familiar with that, you'll know why the casting works very well here. Finally, I also wanted to give a quick shout out to Lindsay Seidel, whose amazing vocal range is clear with her voicing of Eren. Her initial deliveries with Eren are all extremely flat and monotone, as to be expected when portraying someone so dehumanized. But as Eren regains more humanity, she starts to sound more and more human, and Seidel's vocal presence brings this to life, as it's an incredible journey and performance, seeing just how Eren sounds from episode 1 to episode 26, and it's clear that all of this comes from Seidel's own vocal range. It's an incredible evolution and really humanizes the character. Newman Pittman's performance as Reiji also does this and deserves credit as well, even if it is less noticeable because Eren starts off much more dehumanized than Reiji. One final sound note for Requiem for Phantom: a lot of the gun sound effects are done very well. They have a great punch to them and they feel realistic. A lot of the guns sound different, as you would expect for different calibers and types of weapons, and they're very impactful, giving a great punch to something which rightfully should have it. They sound as deadly as they are on screen a lot of the time. And that gets us to the meat and potatoes of this retrospective, the characters and themes of Requiem for Phantom. The show does have a rather small cast, only about 3 main characters and some supporting members of the cast, but it does a good job developing them and their associating themes. Starting off, we will talk on Cal Devon and her commentary on the harsh nature of the world and the cycle of violence. Now I think that Cal is the perfect intro character here because her arc and associated themes are the most general and provide a great jumping off point into really getting to know the characters and themes of Requiem for Phantom. Cal epitomizes the loss of innocence and how the actions around said loss can often entrap people into a negative cycle of violence or despair. In this case, Cal is entrapped by the cycle of violence, going from victim of violent crime to perpetrator of it. Hers is perhaps the most radical character arc here, and I really question the design team here. Yes, this is 2 years later, but did this really need to happen? But while her arc may feel a little forced at times, I can see how someone so vulnerable grew to hate Reiji, especially after being manipulated by big creepy Scythe Master. Put simply, Cal never really had a chance, and that's why she's so tragic, and why her unstable arc feels so natural. Quickly going over Cal's place in the plot, Cal and Reiji first meet when the latter runs into Cal mourning over the death of her sister, who was killed in the crossfire of a gang shootout. Reiji is investigating said shootout, and Cal begs him to take her along with her to avenge her sister. A hesitant Reiji agrees once he learns that Cal is a runaway and has literally nowhere else to go. Cal then moves in with Reiji, and needing to justify this to Inferno, Reiji claims that Cal's natural talent would make her an excellent future assassin. What follows then is a few episodes where Cal and Reiji become close. Reiji gives Cal limited training with a gun and her favorite pocket watch, and Reiji is conflicted about actually training Cal to kill. He doesn't actually want to, but kind of has to, seeing as that this lie is the only thing protecting her and him from Inferno. Once Cal and Reiji think they killed the guy who kills Cal's sister, Cal is saddened to learn that Reiji will not train her because he doesn't want her to end up like him, but she is happy to see that he will let her stay with him. She once again gets upset though when he refuses another request to be an assassin, although she respects Reiji for saying that she's simply trying to protect her innocence and that he doesn't want her to end up like him. This leads to a close conversation where they resolve that instead they will help Reiji get back to his old self. But while all seems well, Claudia's betrayal is revealed, and Inferno goes after Reiji and Cal by association, blowing up his apartment. Cal was at the video store at the time and survived, but not knowing this, Reiji assumes her dead and runs off to Mexico with Eren. Now alone and seemingly abandoned, a crying Cal is devastated and recruited by Scythe Master to become the next Phantom, even volunteering to do so to get revenge on Reiji. Cut to 2 years later, and Cal, now as Phantom, arrives in Japan as part of the dealings with the Gotos. Now trained and armed, she is extremely dangerous and aggressive, antagonizing Reiji, though holding off on violence due to an order from above. Said orders come down because Reiji threatened to hurt Gotos' secret daughter if anything happened to him and Eren. To remove this roadblock, Cal simply removes the daughter Mio, kidnapping her. Lizzie tries to stop her, but Cal kills her in cold blood. She then hides with Mio for a bit, lashing out at her out of fury. She does this because Mio has had an easy life, or at least a normal one, a privilege that Cal was never afforded. And Cal is extremely bitter about this. She's extremely bitter about having never had an opportunity to live a good life, especially considering that she was never afforded an opportunity through no fault of her own. She's bitter about how unfair life can be, and she hates everyone for this, and their supposed lack of empathy. In spite of this though, Mio does show empathy and compassion, making Cal question her whole revenge quest. She then lets Mio go, but still goes on to her arranged duel with Eren because by this point, having betrayed Inferno, Cal figures she's essentially stuck on this path anyways. At the rendezvous point, she is instead met by Reiji, who admits to his mistakes and agrees to Cal's game. She pulls out the watch that he gave her so long ago and claims that when the song stops, both will shoot and the quicker one will win. Reiji is quicker on the draw though when a mortally wounded Cal collapses in his arms. As she passes, she realizes that perhaps her hatred-filled quest was misguided, and that all she really wanted was simple compassion and respect from others. And Reiji affords this to her as she passes, finally having found something she never had, but always wanted. Cal's character is one shaped by the cruel realities of the world, and how said cruelty can warp a person if left unsupported long enough. While Cal starts off as innocent, her hatred and violent streak are already evident from her first meeting with Reiji. A young runaway, she's already experienced horrible things, and it's obvious that only the positive influence from her sister was helping her innocent side flourish. Having lost that sister though, she clings to Reiji as the only real source of emotional support available, and when this departs, she finally snaps. And while you can say that Cal's arc may feel forced and her hatred may feel excessive, I don't hold any of that against her really. I mean, we gotta think about it from her perspective. This is a young girl who's never had an opportunity to live a good life, and has never had anyone in her corner that hasn't either been taken away from her, or seemingly betrayed her. As such, while Cal's hatred does feel a little excessive at times, and she does blatantly lie about how bad of a person Reiji is, it's obvious that this source of hatred does have a logical sense, even if not necessarily a justified one, and I understand why Cal is consumed by her hatred. Seeing how much she's lost, and how little help she's ever got, it's completely understandable. Now, I don't think her violent tendencies are justified, and the show goes on to prove that they are not, but I do understand that at a certain point, she just gives into them because, well, they're all she feels she has left, and that they will not betray her like someone else possibly can. And this is how Cal embodies the cycle of violence. Violence took her sister from her, and to some extent Reiji when we think about it, all for no reason pertaining directly to Cal. The randomness of this all, the cruelty of it, and the lack of help she gets dealing with this embitters her and makes her question why she shouldn't be violent either. She probably realizes that it's not morally justified per se, but also realizes that if she's been hurt so many times for no reason, then she has the right to hurt others for no reason. Because by extension, it seems like an eye for an eye kind of thing to her. She says to herself that her morality has gotten her nowhere, that her innocence has gotten her nowhere, and that growing close to others has only got her hurt. So why bother with any of those things? Why not just seemingly give in to humanity's natural instincts by this point and become the cold-blooded killer that she so wants to be and lash out at those who have hurt her? From this point on, from her separation with Reiji and Shoredesha and the Scythe Master, Cal basks in these violent tendencies, seeking to use them to fill the void left in her heart. She seeks to use thrills and abuses of power provided to her by her power to give her life some kind of meaning, or at least feeling. She wants to know what it's like to be on the other side of the gun, and to feel the thrill of having arbitrary power over those beneath her. Having grown up feeling so crushed, she now wants to experience the high of crushing others. And while it is very heinous, it's also extremely sad, seeing just how far this once innocent girl falls. It's a true embodiment of a loss of innocence, and how a lack of proper support only exacerbates its consequences. Cal cannot be faulted for losing her innocence, and her hatred does have some kind of flawed logic to it, even if not justified. However, none of this justifies her becoming the kind of person that she hated in the first place, the kind of person that hurt her in the first place. And eventually though, Cal learns all of this, and learns that there are reasons not to give in to hate, as her life is slowly consumed by her hatred of Reiji.
As it comes to dominate her life, she stops questioning everything else, or if any of this is even truly worth pursuing or justified. She gives up on herself to some extent, now trapped in a cycle of violence and a job that, while fun for her in spurts, is something that she also hates. She's completely enveloped by hatred, not only of herself, but also of what she does and who she works with, ironically becoming some kind of warped mirror of Reiji, seeing as that he did warn her about this in the first place. By giving so completely into her hatred, she's essentially given herself up to it, and the fact that she only finds happiness after it's gone is proof of this. This all starts when Mio showed her compassion and makes Cal realize, even in exercising all of her hatred and violent tendencies, she never finds the happiness she seeks, instead only realizing a shard of it, or a shard of any emotion other than blind hatred, when Mio decides to show her compassion and make her realize that hatred is just unproductive and blind, that it's not going to give you meaning in life, and that if anyone can show compassion even after being kidnapped and tortured, like Mio has to her, maybe there is hope for her and humanity. This is why Cal lets Mio go, and why she still seeks out Eren, because she realizes that even if she may not receive forgiveness, she must accept her fate and let go of her hatred. She instead, however, finds Reiji, and in a full circle moment, is killed by the man she so hates, in a way kind of symbolizing how her hatred destroyed who she was long before he destroys her physical being. And yet as she dies, he apologizes to her and shows her care and compassion, and she remembers that that's all she really wanted from the very beginning, and that these are two things that are very hard to find when consumed by hate.
Cal's character gets us into a conversation about one of the core themes, if not the core theme, of Requiem for Phantom, which is the loss of innocence. While Cal embodies this the most clearly, it's obviously something that also applies to Eren and Reiji, and perhaps to a very limited extent even Claudia and Lizzie. And in its construction of an operatic tragedy, the show focuses on this theme in order to accomplish the story structure objective. For what could be more tragic than the loss of innocence? Now, to its credit, I don't think that this is for shock value alone, but something that the series wants to have an actual conversation about. In fact, it feels central to Phantom, and there is this dialogue about the pains that the loss of innocence can cause, how people deal with these pains, and how said approaches may help people overcome them or be consumed by them, giving the show a fair degree of nuance. Now, it should be obvious that the loss of innocence, especially under traumatic circumstances, is something which can be quite painful. Every time we see Eren get beat, every time Reiji is crushed by the circumstances around him, and every time Cal snaps, it's something very painful to us as viewers, because we see how this loss of innocence pains people who didn't really do anything to deserve what they're experiencing now. It is this gap between what happens to these characters and how none of them wanted this or initially did anything to deserve this that creates the pain both they and we feel. It is a violation of hopes for a fair or good world, and confirmation that there is pain and evil in it, things which are quite frightening, as these things strike at our very core, our innocence. Now, this theme, of course, is supposed to be disturbing, and this may be one of the only things justifying the tone of the show, as the nihilistic tone here matches the dark impact and traumatic nature that the traumatic loss of innocence can have. Yes, the tone does bury some of the character growth and limited promotion of agency which help negate this pain, but overall the tone is in line with the pain of innocence lost. Such trauma can make it feel as though the world is ending, and that there is no hope for a brighter future, and how the characters, how people deal with this is another aspect of this theme, as we see that this pain can be all-consuming, and oftentimes it's not something which can be easily tackled alone. Some people resign themselves to things, like Eren, or fall into denial, like Claudia, and some lash out in anger, like Cal. On some level, Phantom says that all of these responses are merely that, responses, and therefore they're not as detestable as active malignance, like that of, say, Scythe Master. It wants us to understand this not to justify the actions of any of these characters, but to say that there is a more complex series of motivations for some than just simple greed or evil, that people may do the wrong thing out of pain, and that said pain can override judgment or morality. The wrong thing, of course, is still a wrong thing. However, in circumstances like this, Phantom asks if the perpetrators are victims too. If they are not willing participants in the cycle of violence, are they also victims of it? And this is something I will let the viewer to decide, as on one hand you could make this argument, But on the other hand, you realistically have to ask if that washes away the sins that everyone here commits. And that gets us to the last note here, which is the exploration of how different approaches to this affect those involved and the difficulties that any approach can encounter when taken alone. Everyone in Requiem for Phantom deals with their pain differently. Eren is consumed by it and gives up all hope. She starts to see her status as all there is and will ever be, and accept others and herself, directing abuse and pain towards herself. Cal is consumed by rage that blinds her, and she only maintains this out of some kind of survival instinct, as it's the only thing distracting her from the abandonment that she buries just to avoid complete misery. As part of this, she directs her pain towards others, lashing out at them and seeing no value in their lives because she has been someone who has been lashed out against for no reason so long and struggles to see value in her own life. Nonetheless, there is this through line of redirecting pain towards others or oneself instead of taking time to properly dwell on it and heal. Now, of course, I don't hold that against Cal, Eren, or Reiji due to their extreme circumstances, but it is something to note that if pain becomes too big, it can trap someone in a cycle leading to more pain, and often escaping without some kind of external support is extremely difficult, making this tragedy one that compounds upon itself. Not only are these characters hurt and beat for no real reason, but it leads them to hurting and beating others and themselves for no real reasons. It's a cycle of gratuitous violence and pain, something which is just as frightening as the events that kicked everything off. This is not a condemnation of those who struggle to find help, but a reminder to all of us that there may be people around us that we should help as well, as ultimately, none of the responses here is very effective. Eren always holds herself down, and Cal is completely blind. I think what Phantom is instead saying is that to heal, what someone truly needs is empathy, and to be reminded that innocence may not be reclaimed, but loss of it can be overcome, and that not everything and everyone in the world is evil, or malignant, or disappointing. As ironically, only the empathy of others seems to be something that helps the characters recover from losing theirs. The unquestioning and accepting nature of this reminds them that not all in the world is evil. People need to be reminded of this to help them emerge from their pain, as we see when Reiji reminds Eren that she's still a person and can rediscover who she is, and even gives her a name to prove that she's human. When Cal reminds Reiji that perhaps innocence can live in these circumstances, and Reiji might be able to reclaim a life akin to what he used to have. And when Mio reminds Cal that just because she's hurt her doesn't mean that she doesn't deserve some help with her own pain. All at different points in the story, and all reminding these characters and us that empathy is something truly essential to helping people heal. None of these characters may get their innocence back, but they can learn to live with their current selves. And this is one of the most important things in starting the process loss more healthily and move past one's pain. People need to know that support is out there, and that there is hope, and that it's important to seek it out and accept it before one's pain consumes them, as unfortunately, when refused support or unable to ascertain it, we may see patterns like we do here, and we may see the cycle of pain stemming from the loss of innocence extenuate itself to cost others their innocence. On the topic of hate and being consumed by one's impulses, we next come to a conversation about Claudia McCoonan, Reiji's one-time boss, predator, and failed mafia schemer. Claudia's place in Requiem for Phantom is extremely weird by any writing standards because of how prominently she's built up early on, having a massive impact on the plot and seemingly ethos of the show, and then how quickly the show discards her with almost no pomp once her treacherous nature is truly revealed. Further analysis of her character portrays it less as a brilliant planner and more of a conniving con woman consumed by her own schemes and how they have unraveled beyond her control, who, while monologuing about agency, only does so to really accept the fact that she's discarded her own. How Phantom's writing pretends to build up Claudia almost to completely and unceremoniously discard her upon exposing her flawed worldview and lack of actual moral fiber, something the show pretends she might have early on, is both incredibly bizarre and hollow and sudden, and yet also very poetic, foreshadowed, and in line with the unstable nature of the series as a whole. Her entire arc is attempting to fly closer and closer to the sun and eventually accepting when her wings of wax melt. And while this is obvious to us from the start, her levels of deception both towards herself and others are not. And the sudden reveal of all of this greatly recontextualizes her character. Only right before her fall do we learn of all of her lies and schemes, and how it recontextualizes her entire character is an amazing thing that you don't see a lot of. In another cynical swipe at the audience and the innocence of the viewer, and one that works very well here, note you, Phantom first proposes that maybe Claudia is just morally gray, and maybe she is capable of actual altruism and even helping Reiji. And then the crash and the downfall comes so quickly that it feels like the series is punishing her all at once for everything, all the while betraying any possible viewer trust. All of the twists in Claudia's character come extremely unexpectedly, and her downfall doesn't seem to get the greatest amount of attention in comparison to this. However, while this may seem like weak writing or rushed storyboarding, I don't see it as that, but instead more simply as a manifestation of the massive critical failure in Claudia's worldview. Yes, her character arc and character itself end extremely abruptly, but said ending feels like something that could actually happen, and it feels intentional, like the series is trying to tell us that she's a hypocrite and she's getting cut off from any more screen time, which is debatably true. This may be weird, but I kind of like how suddenly and ungracefully she fails, because it makes for an actual surprise, an unexpected twist, and because in a series that loves over-the-top performances and pomp, this feels out of line with all of that and bizarrely grounded. And yet it is still in line with the idea of the hard plot pivots Phantom built its story upon, and the general theme of many other characters having no complete agency, or no real agency. Let's discuss. Claudia McCoonan is introduced early on in the series as Scythe Master's boss and an executive within Inferno. Her power doesn't come from her own criminal empire like many of her peers, but instead from her own cunning and ability to serve as something of a neutral in internal debates, seeing as that she lacks a major power base. This has, before the start of the series, allowed her to carve out a powerful but pigeonholed role for herself as an administrator under the big boss McGuire. Not content with this though, her arc mostly revolves around her attempts to build her own power base and how this ultimately fails and screws over a lot of people in the process. In her first actual appearances in the series, Claudia approves of Reiji's training and soon takes a liking to him, seeing him as both a useful tool and a person which she sees himself in, and, desirable? Yeah, this is a felony, note you. I'm pretty sure she's over 18, so that's gross and disgusting and deplorable, and foreshadowing of the fact that Claudia actually has no redeeming factors. Getting back to the plot review, seeing herself in Reiji, she tries to comfort him by creating an illusion of agency by stating that even if he is stuck on this path, he still controls the pace at which he moves down it, and that if he moves fast enough, he can, theoretically, outrun being trapped by fate or circumstances and rise above them, something which she implies that she herself did. This is unproven, but perhaps possible. Anyways, Claudia uses Reiji to carry out assignments, and the night of the failed drug deal, calls him over to try and seduce him and give him his old passport. She wants to convince him of her beliefs, and thinks giving him his memories back, via his passport, will do so. It doesn't, but Reiji stays on because he realizes that he's trapped anyways by this point, and he can't just go back to being a regular dude. Also, he's kind of invested in Eren too. Anyways, the failed drug deal results in Scythe Master running away, Reiji and Eren briefly running away, and eventually Eren meeting back up with Scythe Master, and Reiji once again working under Claudia. This is the situation for about 6 months, until Claudia's chickens come home to roost. Seeking to finally gain a power base for herself, Claudia wants to get the Goto family into Inferno. Now, the Goto family was the family involved with the botched drug deal from earlier, and this is important for later notes. Unbeknownst to her though, Scythe Master manipulates both sides in order to sabotage this meeting of the minds and take Claudia down too. He ultimately succeeds, and then returns to McGuire to inform him that he didn't betray Inferno, that Claudia actually did, and that she secretly botched the drug deal from the start so that the Gotos would owe her favors, and also get away with a crap ton of cocaine. With the jig up, Claudia flees to the beach, where Lizzie meets her. Knowing that she's reached the end of the line and can't outrun all of her past decisions now, that she was never able to reach the terminal velocity necessary to in her eyes, Claudia just smiles and accepts her fate as Lily puts her down once and for all. Claudia McCoonan's character is fascinating not only because of its characterization, but also because of the flawed ideological pillars it is based upon. She is ruthless, amoral, and has no loyalty to anyone other than herself. And as a master manipulator, is skilled in this to the point where she unintentionally manipulates herself into buying into her own flawed belief system, which ultimately leads to her downfall. She's also a virtual slave to her own ambitions, which she ironically frames as drive, and the pursuit of them is the catalyst behind all of this. Although Phantom is a somewhat nihilistic series,
I feel it reserves special judgment for Claudia, and her trinicated fate is a condemnation of her idea that we cannot, to some extent, create our own paths in life, or at least influence how we get to the endpoint beyond tempo. I don't think that Phantom State's individual drive and will solve everything, or really anything, but merely that it holds Claudia in contempt because she doesn't even try to deviate off of her quote-unquote assigned path. Getting into her ethos, according to Claudia, power is all that matters, and it should be sought above all else, and there's nothing wrong with using others to acquire it. It's simply a resource to be hoarded, and used as arbitrarily as one sees fit to fulfill their own agendas and dreams and desires. However, oddly enough, she views the application of power in a rather rigid way, believing it, in fact nothing, can change fate, only at what time we arrive at it. This sets up Claudia's ideology and thinking patterns as some of the most interesting in anime I've seen in a while, combining disparate elements of both hard determinism and a pseudo-sacred belief in the power of the individual, meshing them in a way that almost makes sense and is almost not contradictory, but upon zooming out is definitely at least somewhat contradictory. You see, Claudia doesn't believe people can make their own paths in life, instead holding that fate and destiny are basically predetermined things people are just stuck with. However, she also states that while one cannot choose whatever path they want, they can decide the pace at which they pursue it. She supposes that if one pursues their assigned path, quote, fast enough, then they can outrun their destiny and make opportunities and positive outcomes come out of whatever circumstances they may seem trapped in. She says, yes, Reiji, you're now a killer, enslaved to Inferno that has to do whatever I say or face the dangers of a bullet to the brain, but if you're good enough at it, you can rise above the ranks and be able to do whatever you want as a member of Inferno. Now this of course isn't quite true, because even she as an executive doesn't have that much leeway, but it's obvious that she has no belief that one can change their own path, merely that they can make it their own. How Claudia comes to this thinking pattern isn't really revealed throughout the series, though I would guess it arises from both personal circumstances and an attempt to justify her past decisions and current position in life. Claudia joined Inferno so she could climb to the top to avenge her brother, living both in his memory and out of spite for those who killed him. However, joining Inferno is not something you can simply back out of, and now definitely trapped, I think at least part of her thought process is an attempt to tell herself that she can still see through her vision and totally didn't make a huge mistake essentially selling her soul for a small chance at revenge. She clings to this ideology not only because she may or may not believe it, but also because she kinda has to by this point, as it serves as some kind of crutch for questionable decisions. The most blatant manifestation of this is Claudia's attempts to use Reiji to justify her own ideology and or state of being. While it may seem she's genuinely trying to comfort him early on, as we see just how much she lies to him and uses him and holds everyone else in contempt, it's clear that she doesn't actually care about anyone else, and that when she talks to Reiji about agency and outrunning fate, it's almost like she's talking to herself about these topics. She wants to see if Reiji can outrun his fate, just to justify her own philosophies and life decisions for herself. She doesn't really care if he does, though he might briefly depending on interpretation, but only that it's possible for her to do so too. She's anxious and impatient about her position in Inferno, and wants a proof of concept to show that perhaps she really can claw her way up the ranks. Now there is a very stark difference between these two though, and that is that while Reiji is an unfortunate victim forced into this, Claudia elected to do this of her own free will, which is the first hint that there might be some hypocrisy to Claudia's idea of being locked into her fate. As yes, Claudia is, but only after deciding this path for herself, a luxury Reiji of course was never afforded. I mean, technically he is at a point when she gives him his passport, but he's been forced to do so much by this point that that's really just an illusion of choice. Anyways, this establishes a core difference between their ideologies, and ultimately why Phantom discards Claudia so ungracefully. Claudia proclaims the unflinching nature of destiny, and how the only thing that we can do about it is to essentially brute force our assigned paths to the point of excelling at them and kind of claiming them as our own. Reiji, meanwhile, seeks to use this agency to brute force his way out of this assigned path, not by excelling it, but by deviating from it any way he can. That both ultimately fail to some degree is a harsh statement by the series, however, I think we can say that Reiji is ultimately a lot more successful in his endeavors than Claudia. With all of this out in mind, we can see that Claudia's idea of outrunning destiny, while definitely worthy of philosophical debate, is flawed in this instance because it's based on the premise that her path was assigned to her, which in her case it definitely wasn't. She chose this and instead clings to this belief system because it justifies past mistakes, and she needs something to shield herself from this fact. She proclaims unlimited agency on her assigned path,
because she struggles to accept that in choosing this path, she essentially gave all her agency away. This gets us to a very brief but important conversation about the theme of destiny and its place in Requiem for Phantom. While Phantom does not believe in the typical anime trope of willpowering your way out of all problems, it does to some extent acknowledge, rather limited, personal agency, seeing how Reiji and Eren's character arcs unfold. I think that Phantom sees destiny as completely unflinching. It's obvious that it believes in the crushing nature of the world at times, but it seems to say that our destinies, while perhaps predecided, still have variable paths we can use to reach them, saying that we can shape and possibly deviate from our paths at times, even if we cannot change our ultimate fate, we can change how we get there. For example, yes, Reiji and Eren are ultimately killed by Inferno, a pretty predictable outcome when we think about it. But how they get there, after reclaiming themselves and killing Scythe Master and making it all the way to Mongolia, is only one of a multitude of ways this could have happened. They didn't simply die in service to Inferno, and they didn't simply accept everything or even embrace it to try and outdo everyone, as Claudia would propose, but instead took what little wriggle room they could, fought at every chance they could, and eventually enacted a fate that, while similar in a very zoomed out way, killed by Inferno, has different ripple effects, emotional moments, and meaningful character growth that other paths to the same point probably wouldn't. They still enacted a meaningful path that still allowed them to grow and even learn, even if still killed by Inferno. And I think this is the point that Phantom's trying to make about destiny. The destination is important, but that doesn't negate some of the meaningful experiences that we can influence on the way there. While this nuance is somewhat obscured by the objectively grim ending of Phantom, everyone dies and Inferno wins, I guess, and more so by its nihilistic tone, it is a critical idea to the series, and it does add a shred of positive notes to the story arc, and goes a wide way to validate and praise Reiji and Eren's character development. It's not an acknowledgement that willpower can overcome all, however, it is at least a slight acknowledgement of the possibility for some personal agency to be used at some times to at least somewhat improve one's position in life, and that while using it is still important, because even if the destination may not change, the path there can be more enjoyable and more fulfilling nonetheless. With that brief, almost positive note, I guess we should talk about the most repulsive aspect of the show, Scythe Master, real name Helmut von Giuseppe. Now, Scythe Master has to be one of the most twisted, deprived, disgusting, amoral, brutal, sick, perverse, and hideous creatures in all of anime, which is saying a lot. He has no interest in human life and sees it only as something to manipulate for his own entertainment, which is the pursuit of a grand operatic story dictated by himself in his own delusions. There's no angle about money, there's no angle about revenge, there's no angle about justification or any kind of higher philosophy, but solely cold, calculated, controlling, and all-consuming and blatant evil, and its delusional whims. And that's why Scythe Master works for this series. Look, this guy is a sick man that makes my skin crawl whenever he's on screen, but for a series that may or may not be transgressive art, that fits right in. It's only natural that a piece like Phantom would have a Darwinistic predator with no empathy or redeeming factors whatsoever serve as one of, if not the main antagonists, and to his delight, Scythe owns that role unflinchingly. He is a monster, and he is near the core of the series, not only manifesting its ideas on evil, but also a lot of the impetus for a lot of logistical plot stuff, and how he becomes a kind of boogeyman that represents all that it can be wrong with the world and how sick it can be, while not even attempting to provide any kind of justification for his heinous actions, establish him as a truly perverse and sick man. Now, Scythe Master is introduced early on as Eren's quote-unquote handler, and something as a lieutenant to Claudia. While he dislikes her control of him and clearly has his own ambitions, he initially accepts the arrangement and abuses both Eren and Reiji in an attempt to construct his, quote, masterpiece assassins, which he will then use to, quote, execute his grand finale. As time goes on, he starts to become something of a rival to Claudia, and Claudia seeks to remedy this by botching a drug deal so bad and framing Scythe as a traitor. This fails, however, when Scythe escapes, and after manipulating Eren back to him, runs away to lie low in Japan for 6 months. It is here where he meets the Gotos and plots his revenge on Claudia. And he succeeds, successfully wrecking the Gotos' entry into Inferno, making Claudia look bad, ultimately revealing her treachery, and then using all of this as a springboard to get both himself and the Gotos back into Inferno with Eren in tow. His plan does encounter a slight hiccup though, when Eren runs away with Reiji again, although Scythe soon forgets about this when he finds and manipulates a recently isolated Cal Devin into becoming the third Phantom. Cut to 6 months later, everyone meets up in Japan, and wanting to prove that he's on top by having the new Phantom kill the old one, tacitly allows Cal to go after Eren and Reiji. Now she fails, of course, but still wanting to assert dominance and finally reach the grand finale that he's always sought, Scythe shows up with his 6 new killers and tries to see the 2 killed himself. He fails though, and although believing he can once again sway Eren to his cause, is ultimately killed by her, truly shocked for the first time in his life, as she finally stands up to him and proves that he's just a sick man. Later, in the final episode, we get a brief exposition scene explaining that he was a former East German intelligence agent who specialized in brainwashing and creating killers. Now it goes without saying that Scythe Master is a complete monster and a wicked man. He has loyalty to no one other than himself and his sick fantasies, going the great lengths to forward both these and his own agenda. That agenda being the pursuit of a grand finale, that is to say the variable end of his scheming, either resulting in ultimate power or his own death or both. It doesn't really seem like he cares what outcome happens, merely that it's entertaining. Since life is inherently meaningless to him, he doesn't matter if it gets others killed either, and sees the pursuit of this grand finale as the ultimate thrill, testing both others and his own manipulating skills. He sees people as mere dolls for him to use and abuse as he sees fit, and he sees his pursuit of this as proof that he is both alive and above others. Although a master chemist and manipulator, Scythe Master views himself above all as an artist, and his disgusting pursuit of power tripping and his grand finale are the sole things that drive him and the sole things that he seeks to craft. As a complete psychopath with no morality at all, he doesn't have emotions other than subdued rage and the perverse thrills he gets out of controlling others. He loves manipulating and abusing people, not just to prove his power over them, but simply to see him suffer and fulfill his sadistic urges. How he does this, of course, varies, whether it's scheming Claudia's downfall, brainwashing innocent victims, or doing way worse to them. This guy's a predator, as many uncomfortable scenes in the series want us to know, but regardless of any heinous actions he undertakes, his end goal is always the same. He wants his high, and sees no methodology as unacceptable, leading to countless evil acts, many of which not YouTube friendly, like his constant abuse of Eren. Scythe believes that if basically everything is pointless, which he believes for whatever reason, then the world is his sandbox and he should be able to do whatever he pleases. He doesn't use this to justify his own actions, he doesn't really care about that, but this nihilistic worldview is his core. He is an extreme Darwinist that seeks only to serve his own sick kicks, but is unfortunately intelligent enough to forge a web of deceit to forward his goals instead of simply biting off more than he can chew. Worse yet though, all of this evil is not an unfocused chain of horrific events, and he instead forges them together to pursue his grand goal of his grand finale. Scythe sees death as the only true constant, and thus wants to make his and those of others as, quote, stylish and artistic as possible. In his delusions, he seeks not only to lord over others, but fate as a concept in and of itself, and despite acknowledging this as impossible, he seeks to push the boundaries of everything just to see how far he can. Life is merely one big performance to Scythe Master, and crafting the roles in it is what he sees as true power and the ultimate thrill. He wants to decide what he wants to do, and then manipulate everyone into playing the roles he thinks that they should. It is his self-assigned and selfish reason d'etre that manifests so many of his nihilistic and sociopathic impulses. Every nihilistic thrill is merely a building block to his own end, something which he views as inevitable, and thus he hopes to mold all of this to his liking due to his controlling instincts. And yet, as a true lover of chaos and pain, he does leave room for some variances, often pontificating about leaving things to the muses and appreciating the, quote, natural beauty of the natural order, i.e. death and chaos. And he does all this for several reasons. On the most basic level, Scythe does this because he enjoys the simple thrill of gambling, in this case with someone's life. If an outcome is uncertain, it leaves a little wiggle room for something new to happen, which he finds intriguing. A little above this, Scythe also enjoys the challenges that it can pose. As someone who thinks he's the smartest guy in the room, he sees every new unforeseen event as an opportunity to prove this, to prove that he can take control of anyone in any situation, and twist them to serve his goals and trip on more power. Only he is capable or worthy of agency in his eyes, and thus it is his prerogative and challenge to use his to strip everyone else of their own. Finally though, on the, I guess, highest level, Scythe allows and enjoys a basic amount of uncontrolled chaos in his schemes because he views this as proof that that is the natural order of things. Although he doesn't try to justify his actions or
even seek justification to himself for why he does things. This idea that chaos and brutality happen in the real world, which they undoubtedly do, makes him feel vindicated. It makes him feel like every heinous action he does could or would have happened regardless of whether or not he decided to, and thus he is simply, quote, executing the will of man. He's simply, quote, living his natural instincts, and that people like him are merely pristine examples of the, quote, natural order of things. Now, Phantom doesn't believe this in its entirety, but it does believe, and I believe, that Scythe Master is truly evil. And Scythe Master's frequent and heinous abuses get us to Phantom's conversation about both evil in the world and the nature of it. In its viewing of it, evil is simply a predominant and natural phenomenon that occurs often at random with little care for those affected. People may not be inherently evil, but giving into evil urges is an easy and often alluring task. Phantom doesn't try to justify this or the morality of the world or God, but just says that the world is messed up and then proceeds to put this on full display. It's bizarrely objective and materialist in its tone, and while portraying evil acts as obviously bad, feels oddly muted about everything going on screen, accepting that evil things happen constantly, and then refusing to really elaborate on this. Now, morality and even God are concepts mentioned on occasion, as Eren and Reiji recognize that they've done wrong, but even these two concepts are seen as, quote, things for the next life, and not really held to be active influences on the Earth by the characters in the show or the show itself, which instead focus on this idea that it is a, at times, brutal world we live in, dictated by kill or be killed. This is not a denial of morals or God, but instead an assertion that man often cuts himself off from them via his sins, something which comes very natural to him, and that as a result, we need to focus on the immediate world we live in, the pressing circumstances around us, before we can get to higher concepts that are not necessarily as impactful in the moment. In this handling of things, Phantom feels primal, as though consciously refusing any chance to pontificate or operate on a higher, more theoretical, theological, or philosophical level, instead feeling as though it wants to stay on the ground level because that's where things actually happen. That is the world of proof and results and happenings instead of ideas and theories and concepts, which Phantom doesn't really have too much time for, going only so far as to say that evil is evil because it affects those who don't deserve it. Accepting this as a fundamental trait of evil, instead of letting it lead to philosophical diatribes about whether or not this is fair, is key to Phantom's approach. Of course evil is unfair and unjustified, and Phantom doesn't want to waste time pontificating about what it thinks should be a very obvious thing, and a possibly irrelevant why. It doesn't care why evil happens, merely that we know it does, and how tragically impactful that can be. The show trusts the viewer to see the sins on screen and go, that's really bad, and be uncomfortable, instead of actually questioning things too much. And for this reason, at least part of its cold lack of open condemnation of evil feels natural, because it seems that fandom wants to be so blatant that everything on screen should obviously be condemned and that questioning things becomes redundant. It doesn't promote things by staying silent. Instead, it simply allows you time to think and realize for yourself that, wow, that was messed up. And I think it's important that we delineate between these two, because I can see how someone could get confused and think that Phantom is promoting or okay with a lot of the heinous things on screen. It's not, it's just that it makes these things so heinous that it's obvious to us that they're heinous, and that fact is going to be true regardless of why things happen, and that the why is not really the focus here. According to Phantom, evil acts and their consequences pervade society, and their ripple effects are often one of the great forces molding and shaping it, forcing it to change as people either try to counter it, or as often here, exploit it. The whole premise of the show, in fact, embodies this cold influence idea through its own setup, as all three Phantoms are essentially forced into becoming who they are by forces beyond their control, conducting acts that they are powerless to really stop. Phantom does acknowledge that this is a cruel tragedy, simply saying, these things happened, in an oddly distant tone. Some may view this as injustice, some may view this as natural, some may view it as tragic, and others may call it a thrill. Regardless, every character in the series is lost, and there is no character which is upright or clean, all of which are shaped by the mistakes and sins of those around them and their own. There is no quote-unquote complete redemption arc, even if there is a lot of good character development, and this is not a flaw of the series, because the series is very open about the fact that everyone has done horrible things here, and because every character here is more fixated on the immediate goals of either feeding their own sins or escaping those of others and themselves. Yes, Reiji and later Eren do develop their sense of morality, and to some extent try and to succeed from outrunning the evil acts of others, but considering how many sins they've already committed, even against their own will, they are consumed by feelings that they are tainted by sin in their own eyes. And they don't deny this, they just see it as something they can't fix, even if they can no longer add to it, believing instead that it's simply too late for them to be saved, at least in this world. I do appreciate, though, that at the very least, the series doesn't seem to hold this against them, and in this way maintains its objectivity. It's important to note that Phantom doesn't promote evil, more so just opens our eyes to it, so that we can condemn it on our own terms. It also does not regard agency as completely useless either, even if evil seems to win in this case. The previous point about destiny, about how paths to the same point can vary, does still place at least some value on agency, and it's important to note that most of the evil characters are consumed by it. And both of these concepts vindicate morality and avoiding evil. It's just that they're kind of downplayed here, as Phantom instead wants to focus on the idea that evil is out there, that it's often prevalent, that it's not justified, and that Phantom merely wants to document it and how it consumes people. Now that we've touched on the nature of evil in Requiem for Phantom, I think it's important that we briefly touch on a few more characters that commit evil acts throughout the series, starting with Mr. Shiga of the Goto family. This guy's a bitch! Anyways, Daisuke Goto is the head of the Goto family, or one of their top representatives when we first meet him. He serves as kind of a almost caricature, but definite representative of the sort of old mafia family that we would kind of expect to see in this kind of picture, and how the evil of Phantom surpasses even that to the extent where Mr. Daisuke is kind of just a pawn in this whole thing, and ends up regretting all of his dealings with Inferno. And for this reason, Daisuke is kind of very interesting because not only is he very powerful in his own world, that of the Goto family, but is not very powerful in the wider world, that is the Inferno expanded crime universe. And as we can see by how he's kind of used and tossed aside by Scythe Master, the show itself is kind of tossing aside the idea that this will be a sort of conventional mafia narrative or kind of story. Now, even though Daisuke is a tertiary character, who serves mainly to illustrate this process, as well as oiling some of the wheels necessary to get the plot rolling along, he's still pretty well characterized and rather interesting in this way. He is a man of convictions who is very confident in himself and his assigned paths. He believes in what he's doing, and he believes that no matter what happens, he'll somehow manage a way out of things and come out on top. He's bold, brash, and confident, and in this way embodies the sort of typical, classical mafia archetype that we might expect from this series. An archetype also embodied by Tony the Stone, who, while a bit character, does also exemplify this, and also serves as an example of how Inferno's evil surpasses what we expect from this kind of conventional narrative, illustrating not only that they are bad, but also the fact that this is a show which is going to transcend what we expect when it comes to morality. Anyways, in this way I guess you could argue that both Tony and Daisuke are also kind of tragic, in that while criminals, they are still criminals with some code of honor, and Inferno's below even that and disposes of them ruthlessly once it sees no need for them. However, this fixation on Inferno leads us to a brief conversation on the big boss of Inferno, that being Mr. McGuire. Now, Mr. McGuire is fascinating in the world of anime big bosses, both for how powerful he seems and how little he actually does in terms of anything, whether it be characterization, screen time, plot logistics, lore, etc., etc. This guy is the big boss of Inferno, so I guess you could consider him the big bad of the series, and yet he doesn't even interact with any of the Phantoms more than twice, I think, and we really don't see much of this guy, as the only times we really see him are when he's delegating tasks to Scythe Master and Claudia, and these delegating scenes in and of themselves aren't that common. For this reason, McGuire does a good job as serving as a sort of ominous, overhanging evil presence throughout the series, and also does a rather poor job serving as a main antagonist, to the point where I don't really consider him the main antagonist, seeing as that I think the main emotional conflict is more between Scythe Master and Eren, and McGuire is kind of just the guy who set up the framework that allowed all of this to happen. He doesn't have a presence for most of the series, and in fact I forgot he was in it once everyone got to Japan, and this is by design, oddly enough. As a story that wants to closely fixate on the main characters of Eren and Reiji, Requiem for Phantom doesn't necessarily feel it has a need to expand on the lore of Inferno and the wider world of Inferno, and to its credit,
I agree with this assertion, as the character drama here is compelling in and of itself, and really adding an extra layer of lore to it would have been nice, but it wouldn't necessarily have added anything or made this narrative any more compelling. It was unnecessary, and so Requiem cut that out. In fact, you could even consider that a plus, as not only does it a lot more time to focus on the actual character drama that the story seems to fixate on, but it also makes McGuire more nebulous and undefined and mysterious, and to also serve as a sort of hazy metaphor for the nebulous nature of the concept of evil, reaffirming the fact that Phantom focuses on the practical side of things, i.e. Eren and Reiji escaping from Scythe Master's abuses, rather than the metaphysical or conceptual side of things, i.e. the kind of big picture evil that McGuire embodies. Yes, we know he's bad, and he does bad things, we don't like him, but he's not necessarily defined, and I think that's fine. Its pretty pointless presence embodies Phantom's point that evil is ultimately pointless in and of itself. While Eren and Reiji's arcs are presented as only temporarily successful, perhaps pointless in the end, so is everything that Inferno does, especially McGuire. Yes, Inferno and McGuire do expand their operations and power, and acquire ludicrous amounts of wealth, but for what purpose does that really serve? Does it give McGuire a sense of purpose? It doesn't really seem so, I would argue not, since he never seems to be completely sober in any scene he's in. He's always drinking something that's bubbly, and he doesn't necessarily seem to have a deeper motivation behind accumulating more power and money. Everything he does, every evil act, seems to be ultimately just to serve itself, seems to be ultimately pointless, both enhancing their evil and speaking to the notion that even if good may seem pointless at times, evil is all the time. For while Reiji and Eren may have arcs that may be considered pointless at points, or perhaps at their conclusion, McGuire's purpose and presence throughout the series seems pointless in its entirety. As mentioned earlier, McGuire feels like someone who's just kind of tacked on. He doesn't have a presence of his own. He doesn't even really have a personality. He's barely present for plot stuff, so he feels pointless. And as the embodiment of the nebulous concept of evil here, this is kind of Phantom also saying that evil in itself is pointless. Thus, while McGuire is someone who is hard to talk about and doesn't really do anything, if I'm being honest, it speaks to how evil can also do nothing constructive in the long term. And I think Phantom does a good job showing that ultimately, a lot of the violence on screen and all of the mafia scheming is ultimately pointless because everyone involved either dies or seems to be pointless in and of themselves with their limited amount of screen time. Okay, having talked on these two characters for a little bit, I think it's time I actually talk about Shiga from the Gotos. There's a little joke before. So Shiga of the Gotos is a bitch. However, that is not to say that evil entirely consumes everybody, or everything. While Requiem for Phantom does have a darker tone, it is not entirely dismissive of human agency or ability. It often portrays them as hopelessly outmatched, yes, but it never completely dismisses them as futile or pointless. Even here, humanity can to some extent survive, and this idea of grim survival is one of the more subtle through lines here, most embodied by the main character of Reiji, Azuma. Now, Reiji is the main character of Phantom, and an embodiment for many of its less shocking aspects. If Eren tackles the darkest themes of soul-crushing abuse and nihilism, and cow-blind vengeance and fury, Reiji falls in this odd midground where he witnesses both, is tempted by both, arguably partakes in both, and yet emerges, temporarily, victorious, if scarred. He grows more and more morally gray as the series progresses, becoming something of an anti-hero even perhaps, but he does survive, and is not blatantly evil regardless of how one may look at his various sins throughout the series. He feels less dedicated to the ideas connected to him than the other two characters, and while this may mean that he's a less striking character, he's also much more balanced. Now, I don't think this balance is his core identity, but instead a survival instinct he relies on, and a necessary writing measure to ensure that everything he does makes some kind of sense. He's not an upstanding man, and he's not a saint, but he's not a demon either, and this balance is necessary in order to maintain the moral gray sphere which he dwells in, and which defines a lot of the tone present in Requiem for Phantom. Reiji is able to carry on and go selectively numb, without completely losing himself, maintaining a sort of functional distance from his own emotions, things that Cal doesn't seem too good at, and which Eren takes too far. As far as the construction of a protagonist is concerned, it's not the most conventional here, as even though Reiji does have quite a bit of good and nuanced character growth, he does not, in my opinion, grow as much as Eren, although the two are needed to make the other one functional. Where Eren is the most inspirational character who grows the most and inspires Reiji to start his quest, the quest itself and Reiji's underlying compassion and empathy and humanity are critical elements needed to kickstart Eren's growth at all. Reiji is essentially a really good supporting character cast as the main character, and while this is a tad unconventional, it's fine and makes logical sense as both Cal and Eren are so devastated at different parts of the narrative that I question how they could function as the main characters throughout its entirety. The emotional distance Reiji is able to maintain, and indeed his air of moral grayness, is also critical as it means he seems less biased than the other two, or at least tends to maintain more open views, allowing the viewer to more easily formulate theirs and empathize with everyone here. His actions are not simply neutral, but do serve in this purpose of establishing him as a sort of blank slate main character with defined senses of compassion, empathy, self, and gratitude, all of which allowing the viewer to both follow and bond with Reiji. Beneath all of this, though, are still the pronounced subcurrents of what it means to live and how, quote, sinful Reiji really is. While he is forced into Inferno, he still has blood on his hands, regardless of whose fault that it's there, and how he and the series navigate this is another interesting aspect here. We may not like to admit our main characters are at best morally gray killers, even if through no fault of their own, but to the series' credit, both it and the cast themselves are very open about this, opening up avenues to deeper conversations that the series may seem to generally avoid. All of these reasons make Reiji a very capable and interesting main character for Requiem for Phantom, and one which fits its narrative structure and overall narrative goals very well, even if he does not develop as much as Eren does, something which, to be fair, is quite difficult to do considering the scope of development that Eren undertakes. Getting the Reiji's place in the plot, Reiji is first introduced in the first episode, where he runs from and fights the first Phantom, Eren. He then trains under Eren once Scythe Master and Claudia identify him as, quote, having potential. Here, he not only learns how to kill, but also Eren's state and her pain. From the very beginning, he wants to help Eren, and although his early attempts are refuted, he does continue to try and empathize with her and humanize her, and this does bear fruit later on. Anyways, as the two soon start to work together and almost start to bond, he then comes to Claudia's attention, who starts to make inappropriate contact with him, although she also does give him his old passport as a sort of gift. This brings Reiji's memories back, and he seriously considers going home, but he remembers two things. One, he's done too much evil to simply wash his hands clean and walk away, and two, he remembers what Eren's going through and that she still needs help too. All of this occurs during the failed drug deal, which leads to Eren getting shot. He then tracks Eren down to the desert hideout where he figured that she would be. Here he saves her life and she agrees to run away with him. Here he gives her the name Eren, promising that he will help her find her home, remember who she is, and finally smile. This is the first thing he does that truly impacts her. Now this of course doesn't last long, as he's soon captured and told to kill Scythe, and Eren herself is manipulated into returning to Scythe. The plot to kill Scythe Master fails though, when Eren takes the bullet meant for him, and we then cut to 6 months later, when Reiji is essentially a completely new guy. Much more jaded and embedded into Inferno's operations, he has become a cold, cynical, and callous hitman who, with nothing left to look forward to or live for, has fallen into Inferno as the model of a soulless phantom, killing simply because he's told to, and simply because he has no will to resist anymore. He works closely under Claudia, and is obviously in deep emotional pain, and obviously haunted by not only Eren's apparent death, but also by his apparent lack of a meaningful life, as well as the pointless violence that he's forced to commit upon others. By this point, he's become a sort of more aggressive mirror to Eren, one who still has feelings, but similarly hates himself and places no value on himself or anything really, due to the dehumanized state in which he lives. His chance encounter with Cal Devins, though, and their subsequent adventures do remind him that perhaps there is hope for him, as Cal does see good in him. It's also important to note that during his time with Cal, he is the one that proposes that she should be his assassin assistant, not because he actually craves this for her, in fact he desperately wants her to avoid joining Inferno in any capacity, but because he realizes that Inferno is going to have their eyes on her, and he sees this as the best way of keeping her safe. Over said adventures,
He also runs into Eren again, and no longer simply able to repress his pain, starts to question everything even more. With Claudia's betrayal revealed and Cal's apparent death in the apartment explosion, Reiji then runs away alone and is tracked down by Eren, who is told to kill him to assert her role as a true phantom. A re-brainwashed Eren then tries to kill Reiji to prove that she is the real phantom, but as Reiji simply surrenders, claiming that fighting is pointless now, Eren breaks down and says that he must kill her because he is the only proof that she's actually alive. Realizing that she's been manipulated by Scythe Master this entire time, he simply tells her that they can both live in order to prove that they're both still alive. With this resolution, and the affirmation that they are the only two that actually care about each other, they then run away to Mexico. 2 years later in Japan, they once again become entangled with Inferno, and Reiji grapples with the morally questionable tasks of manipulating Mio for his own safety, and having to put Cal down. While he fails in the former, it does lead to the latter, and he comforts Cal in death, having stated that he takes responsibility for the fact that she was led down the path that she has been led down, even if he only did so out of the intention of trying to save her life from any Inferno-related murders. As in spite of his best intentions, Cal has become entangled in this world of violence and murder, and suffered for it. With Cal's final death though, and the limited closure it brings, he teams up with Eren to finally take down Scythe Master once and for all. And with Scythe Master's death, Reiji finally manages to make his way to Mongolia with Eren, where she is finally able to find herself again and smile for real. Reiji, for his part, someone who has hurt so many in his words, is finally that he finally kept the promise and helped someone, even if it cost him his own life. Now Reiji is a man who is fascinatingly self-aware of his sins. He knows he's no saint, and yet doesn't use this knowledge to justify anything other than absolutely necessary violence. I can't say he's morally upright, but I can't say that he's the most heinous example of evil here either. He's almost perfectly morally gray for a series like this, and relative to those around him, he is still among the most, if not the most moral of the cast here. Through all of his trials and tribulations, he still maintains something akin to empathy and compassion for most of his screen time, though it is important to see how the manifestation of these change over time, as they go through 3 major phases. Early on, Reiji is more naive, more compassionate, and more easily hurt. There seems to be this hopelessly naive hope that somehow everything will just work out okay. He simply tries to run away with Eren with no plan, and this initial innocence is put down when Eren is shot, and Reiji gives in to the Inferno way, finally crushed by his circumstances, with Eren's apparent death. His empathy makes a resurgence though with Cal's arrival, and while now starting to loathe himself for his past mistakes and violence, he still thinks that maybe he can go back to being his old self again, and maybe things might work out. Once again though, this is shattered by the seeming death of someone close to him, and Eren's return. Running away with Eren, though, his compassion and empathy do stick around to some extent this time. This belief of course fades, as he needs to come to terms with his mistakes and the evils of others, especially his abandonment of Cal. While this abandonment was made out of hasty fear and not premeditated, it is something that I think that we can reasonably argue is to some extent his fault. I mean, he didn't even try to search the apartment, and put simply, some could argue that he didn't handle the whole scenario the best. That being said, this third, much more open and honest embodiment of his empathy is his final form. In this state, the one we see him in Japan, Reiji is still compassionate and empathetic, but has finally let go of the naive belief that somehow everything will be okay. Because he's seen enough to know that it simply won't, that things simply won't ever go back to being the same as they were before, and that there probably will be no status quo, at least for a while. He's seen and done enough to know that everyone has sinned, himself included, and that at best he's morally gray. In this final form, Reiji is much more withdrawn, and his empathy is less pronounced. And it's still a great testament to his strength that it remains at all. Reiji is a survivor, and while simply existing may not sound the most impressive, doing so here in all of its context, all the while maintaining some sort of sanity and sense of self, is. It's both why Reiji is less striking than Eren and Cal, and yet arguably stronger and more balanced than both. He has a better sense of who he is and who he was before, and this is a better foundation to anchor himself with and to. Now it is important to note that although all of this does allow Reiji to carry out positive actions at times, he is, at least in his eyes, still tainted by sin, and this adds the next critical layer to Reiji's character, his perception of guilt, how much of that is warranted,
and how both he and the series handle this. Now, it is undeniable that both Reiji and Eren are killers and have hurt many. We may not like to dwell on this since they are the protagonists here and are victims to some extent themselves, but it is true, and to Phantom's credit, even if we do not want to dwell on the sins of the characters here, Phantom is fine with doing so to some extent, and Reiji and Eren themselves admit to feeling guilt for their past actions, even if it's not what they wanted. I add this disclaimer because Phantom hints at asking how guilty Reiji and Eren really are. It asks that if they were forced into this, is it perhaps possible to absolve them of some sin? Are they truly guilty? Now, I will let the viewer dwell on this, but again, to its credit, Phantom stars characters who simply say, no, it doesn't absolve us of anything, and maintains the sort of disconnected objective lens that it's known for, simply stating that these are people who did wrong and therefore, to some extent, are guilty. Now, it doesn't explicitly condemn them as it would evil people like Scythe Master, but it still holds them as having sinned, and instead of going off into the weeds about the philosophical underpinnings of guilt, simply says that there has to be some guilt attested to both of them, and both of these characters acknowledge this, simply stating that it's all they can do to carry on, and that even if bound for hell from this point on, they still want to live a quiet life while they can. Reiji does start to hate himself and his past actions, and as the series progresses, we as viewers can question how culpable he is, we can question how much he should hate himself, and we can question how much of a victim he is. But this doesn't really matter because, regardless of theoretical answers, Reiji carries on in spite of all of these questions and doesn't let his past abuses justify new ones. Phantom doesn't want to lionize him, but it does seem to back his extremely pragmatic approach to things here and admire his ability to survive. That's it. He's a sinner, he's a killer, and he's someone with a lot of blood on his hands. But he's also someone still capable of empathy, and he's also someone who's pulled Eren out of the abyss that she was caught in. He's still someone who has had positive impacts with the limited agency as he's had, even if his great power has been used by others above him for acts of evil. Ultimately, he acknowledges that whether or not he goes to heaven or hell is not up to him, and that he simply wants to be able to help Eren rediscover her humanity, and at least try to work their way through this, guilty or not. Reiji is human for better and worse, and he embodies extremes in both regards. He brutally kills strangers, but only for his own survival. He loyally clings to the killer Eren, but only to try and help redeem her. He introduced Cal to all of these things, though only in an attempt to spare her life. He is flawed, though struggling with many of these flaws and evils forced upon him. A spark of benevolence, of compassion, and of humanity always survives long enough to impact Eren for the better. It may lead to misguided or naive actions with no hope of success. Protecting it may require hurting others, and his humanity and empathy may flicker at times. But regardless, all of these endure, and that's Reiji's true strength, his true power. His is not a tale of redemption, but a tale of survival. It is not a tale of moral uprightness, but instead a gray man who endures. It is a tale mired in blood and guilt, but one which perseveres. Reiji may be hated by Cal, and he may be hated by himself, but he survives. He may be hunted and he may be maimed, but his empathy survives. Side by side with Eren, and with nowhere to haunt, he survives. Reiji isn't supposed to be likable or relatable because he's a saint, or because he takes an unrealistically righteous stance against Inferno, but because he survives. Because his humanity survives. Now, it's been stated several times, and will be stated several more times, that I consider Requiem for Phantom to be one of the most disturbing things I've ever talked about on this channel. And that's for good reason. While it's not a comfortable subject to dwell on, Requiem for Phantom has a running theme of abuse and degeneracy. And this abuse takes all forms: emotional, physical, and in YouTube-appropriate language, implied predation. Since this is a series that wants to root itself in the real world, the execution and impact of all of this, especially the predation part, is extremely disturbing, as this is not something which happens in the horrible rundown inbred ghettos of Technolize, but something which happens in a Philadelphia warehouse. And this is why the abuse here feels more impactful and disturbing. It's especially disturbing when we realize that this isn't something happening in a far-off animated world, but something which happens in the real world, as unfortunate as that may be. And we see a lot of the negative impacts of this kind of abuse in all of the characters, especially in Eren, who is abused the most. It obviously inflicts great pain on her. The devastating impact of abuse on the victims is clear here. Now, to clarify, I don't think that all of the abuse shown here is simply for shock value alone, although it's very obvious that they are constantly pushing the limits of censorship, but also to, in storytelling terms, to show and not tell, as well as to simply get across to us how brutal the real world can be. It's extremely uncomfortable, it's often graphic, and certain scenes actually made me sick and I needed to walk away for times. There is a line between story relevant and gratuitous, and censorship does figure into this, and where that line lies for you, or where you think it should lie, is at least a little subjective, but it did cross lines in my eyes, though knowing this series it probably intended to. Fortunately, though, the character of Eren does show us other things about abuse, and especially that abuse does not have to define someone, for recovery is possible, if at times difficult. That there's a lot more to Eren than just what she suffered through, and that she does eventually come to reclaim her own self. Finally, that gets us to talking about Eren. While Reiji is the main character of Requiem for Phantom, I think it's pretty obvious that Eren is the centerpiece, so to speak. Hers is the character with the most character development, arguably the most impact, and from a meta standpoint, the most market presence. And while Phantom is a rather nihilistic and grim story at times, I am very glad that Eren at least found some peace and a very complete story arc, going from completely refusing to even entertain she might have a soul or point to existence, to embracing these things and letting them drive her quest to finally reclaim herself from the demons that snatched them away from her so long ago. It's a very rough, but ultimately fulfilling and arguably somewhat realistic, from a psychological standpoint, triumph over past traumas, proving that it can be done, but also that doing so is often more difficult and painful than in most shows and movies, that it's never a linear process, and that it's always something that is quite intensive. If characters like Scythe Master embody Phantom's proclamation of the senseless violence and viciousness in the world, then Eren and Reiji embodied a fight to, if not defeat it, free oneself from it, for at least a bit, a struggle which the two are at least somewhat successful in. Now, we first meet a very dehumanized Eren in episode 1, where she pursues and almost kills a fleeing Reiji. When he almost kills her, she is later assigned to training him as her assistant. In this process of doing so, she trains him how to kill and tries to install her bleak worldview to him. She knows that she's trapped and supposes Reiji will soon be too, instructing him to give up on hopes and dreams of escaping and accepting that he is a meaningless tool now, all of which things she believes applies to herself. In spite of this though, Reiji grows to care about Eren, and while she does refute his ideas on escape and becoming human again, they do start to lurk in the back of her mind. After a few missions together and some character bonding, the two find themselves on opposite ends of the failed drug deal. Scythe Master escapes, and Eren takes a bullet and crawls back to the desert safe house after being shot. Here, Reiji saves her life, and bestows the name Eren upon her. Before this, she was merely referred to as Ein. Her time on the lam doesn't last long though, as a manipulative Scythe Master finds her alone and convinces her to come back to him. All the while, Claudia catches Reiji and convinces him to kill Scythe. This almost succeeds, but Eren, still being manipulated by the Scythe Master, takes a bullet for him and falls into the sea. Scythe saves Eren though, and the two lie low in Japan for a bit until he instructs Eren to disrupt Claudia's dealings with the Goto family. She succeeds in doing so, and even warns Reiji to run while he can, and is eventually tasked with killing him. By this point though, Reiji's words and past actions have started to get to her, and she's unable to kill him, proclaiming that he is the last person to think of her as human, and so therefore that killing him would be like ending herself. She therefore says that Reiji must live and kill her. He of course refuses, and the two run to Mexico. Cut to 2 years later, and the two are now in Japan, and Eren's recovery seems to have made great progress, as she's much more human now, and uses a much warmer tone when speaking. When Inferno comes to town, Eren tries to get safe passage out, though not before having to deal with Cal and Inferno. While Reiji settles things with Cal, Eren takes out the Goto guys. With this done, she and Reiji then team out to take Scythe Master out and his 6 killers. Once she isolates him, he once again attempts to manipulate her, but fails, as a now rehumanized Eren proclaims that she is human again in one of the most emotionally impactful anime scenes out there. She claims that yes, she is a skilled killer, but that also means that she was a template for these duplicates of her that she so easily takes out. And yet she also realizes that that is not her only purpose, that she's not a tool for others to use, and that she is Eren, regardless of what her old name or old person used to be. She is a person now, and that person is hers to control and dictate action to. She is not a tool for Scythe Master, and she is not his creation. She is merely his victim, and she is someone who will reclaim herself from her abuser. And her killing Scythe Master is a beautiful sort of metaphor for her kind of overcoming and escaping the evil of the world, for at least a little while. She then escapes to Mongolia with Reiji, and here she views the skies and remembers that this is her home, and she finally finds peace. Even if the ending implies she ate poison to escape recapture or killing by Inferno. Now, Eren's character arc needs to be studied for the sheer amount of character development it accomplishes and its layered path to overcoming trauma. She becomes an almost entirely new character, but one built upon the husk we see in episode 1 and clearly descended from it. While Eren cannot escape the unfortunate fate that befalls her and Reiji, she is able to escape the crushing dehumanization and abuse that she is forced to endure for so long, and that in it of itself is inspirational. So too is how the development unfolds. It's not a typical linear path that we see in a lot of anime, but instead an extremely uneven and emotional trek. Phantom is not afraid to completely dehumanize Eren when we first meet her. I mean, they even take away her name and replace it with a simple number. And it's almost frustrating how much they commit to this. This is not an insult to this approach or the realistic result of Eren's suffering, but a compliment on how much Phantom is willing to commit to this, how much time it takes, and how brutally blunt it can be with the current state of Eren's psyche when we first meet her. And all of this makes all of her later growth much more impactful. It's extremely painful seeing how poorly she's treated and how crushed her soul is when we first meet her, when all she can do at this point is try to rationalize everything. We want to see better for her, and we want to see her escape because her pain is just so visceral. And while she does manage to do this, the path to this is not linear. As in the real world, the path to healing here is full of twists and turns, and what could even be considered setbacks and relapses, as Eren doesn't buy in the Reiji's idea of agency until about the halfway point of the series. She's given up on the idea of being whole again, and Reiji initially kind of has to drag her along as she actively refutes his ideas about making her whole again. Only after a lot of experiences and some mistakes and bonding does she actually start to trust him and take his words to heart. And in a world of instant gratification and linear character arcs, Eren's initial refusal and denial could come off as frustrating, as that's not what many viewers may want. However, that's why this is something of a masterpiece, because the important part that Phantom wants us to realize is we need to ask why she is so defeated. And only after doing so can we truly appreciate her circumstances and her growth when she does start to. A key example of this is that even after Eren and Reiji run away for the first time, Eren returns to Scythe Master and seemingly betrays Reiji. When I saw this for the first time, I was stunned. Scythe is obviously evil, and he's obviously abusing her, and Eren is obviously in pain. Why are we doing this? And then I thought about it. Eren is so scared and dehumanized by this point in the series that this is the quote safe option in her mind, and she just defaults to it because it's all she knows in her immense fear. This isn't bad writing. It is a disturbingly realistic display of a dynamic present in many abusive relationships. And this makes me realize that while this is a fictional character, there is substance here and links to the real world, and it makes us empathize with her more, not because we agree with this questionable decision, but because it's a brutal testament to just how broken Eren is, and just how much pain there can be both in this fictional world and in our real world. And it draws a clear line in the sand that Eren is eventually able to cross as she gains more of herself back, providing a finish line by which we can measure her healing by later. And we start to see progress towards this when, while working against Claudia, Eren never actually harms Reiji and even starts to look out for him. She's always remembered his kindness and is slowly picking up the pieces of her mind and learning kindness in part for herself, learning how to be herself, or at least try to. Finally, she and Reiji run away by the final arc, and she starts to become her own person again, no longer dominated by Scythe or her own fears, but by her own heart and her mind and soul and moral compass. And I think the best example of this is how she dismantles the mass killers that Scythe sticks on her. She knows that they're modeled after her, and so claims her place as the original to dispatch them,
but not as the original who was abused or neglected, but instead as simply herself, someone of immense skill, and someone who can now use that skill for her own bidding as opposed to those who would exploit her. This is not a celebration of the past, but instead a statement that through all of it, she is who she is and is capable of a lot, and has finally realized that. And she manages to cross the finish line she wasn't able to earlier, that she was too afraid to earlier, killing Scythe Master and establishing herself for herself, and she manages to be human again. Stumbles, starts, and stops make us evaluate Eren's pains, and roadblocks make us realize that trauma is not something that can just be talked away in a few character moments over the course of a week. People don't feel trapped in it because they want to, but because they're overwhelmed by it and may need help with it. And it's not right to hold that against someone in and of itself, because they may want help, they just may not have it, or may not know how to ask for it. And yet, it is something they can overcome, as while recovery can take years, and it isn't always steady, it is still possible. And this is why the slow simmer that is Eren's character is magnificent. It feels more earned and, dare I say, realistic. In the real world, others can and do speak healing words to each other. However, often in media, the immediate impact of these words may be overplayed and exaggerated. In Phantom, they are not. Indeed, in Phantom, the healing process is not, as it's arguably not even completed, and yet still very meaningful. Early Eren somewhat logically dismisses Reiji's encouragement as mere words. It's a pained response that we can see in the real world, and not a simple refusal to grow. Considering all we see her go through, it makes sense, as why should she trust in this guy she just met, and his claim that he can help her escape this crippling situation she finds herself in? It's only logical that it takes time to convince her, and it's only logical that there are setbacks because his words do not ring true immediately. Every setback she has, though, should not be viewed as frustrating, but instead as tragic bumps on the road to recovery. And the fact that she overcomes each bump is a reward in and of itself, and inspirational. And this construction of a character arc is something that we don't necessarily see a lot of today, as it truly makes you wait quite some time to get off the ground. But the fact that it does makes the payoff even more impactful because it feels more real and earned. And at the conclusion of this arc, Eren does become her own person and reclaim at least some of what was taken from her. And this is the true beauty of her soul, that she's found hers again. As while Eren's is not a traditional, quote, redemption arc, she feels guilt about her past sins but realistically acknowledges she can't undo them, she does reclaim her soul, she does redeem it for herself. And her doing so is perhaps the most emotionally impactful and powerful aspects of the series, even, for at least a time, overshadowing the bitter ending and haunting nature of the series. Yes, Eren still dies, but at least now it wasn't a death completely in vain, and it wasn't a life completely wasted for the horrible agendas of others. And now it perhaps even serves as proof that individual agency can help us live better, more meaningful lives, even in the bleakest of circumstances. And even in said circumstances, people still have souls, and can even reclaim them.
That finally gets us to the section on Lizzie Garland, the final character I want to talk on, and a very underrated member of the cast. Where Requiem for Phantom is a series whose cast is mostly defined by either their flaws and pain, or their complete evil and degeneracy, Lizzie Garland feels very balanced, and for lack of a better term, accessible. Yes, Lizzie is still a criminal with blood on her hands. But she's also the only one who is neither forced into this or relishes this. She's a true professional who does this out of a somewhat noble goal, that of supporting her best friend Claudia, and she maintains a relatability and true sense of self we don't see too much of here. She's human without being forced to the human extremes that the rest of the cast are. Now she of course has emotions and an arc of sorts about simply being unable to do this anymore, but she isn't insanely evil, and in her own words, she isn't a genius, just pretty good. She has emotions in a series chock full of emotional repression and abuse, and seeing this alone makes Lizzie's presence and genuine care for Claudia, and to some extent Reiji, genuinely touching. She is not the soul of the series, but a reminder that most of the people in it, and indeed most of us watching it, still have souls. Now Lizzie Garland is initially set up to be as both Claudia's closest lieutenant and friend. She's deadly capable with her pistol, and while freely speaking her mind, is still rather professional, handling a lot of the day-to-day operations for Claudia, all the while serving as a source of restraint and reason. When Reiji goes rogue, Lizzie helps drag him back, and then she teams up with him to try and kill Scythe Master. While this mission does fail, Reiji's conduct during it earns her respect, and from this point on, the two form a respectful personal relationship. This relationship is expanded when Reiji becomes the new Phantom, and Lizzie essentially becomes his temporary partner. When Claudia's betrayal is revealed, Reiji is considered too close to be trusted, and also hunted down, but Lizzie is given an opportunity to, quote, redeem herself and put Claudia down. Now, she doesn't want to do this, especially since she still cares for Claudia, but she goes through with it not out of spite, but out of the simple realization that there's no realistic way Claudia can get out of this, and her being afforded her choice of execution and executioner is probably the best deal she's gonna get. This also spares Lizzie's life and cements her as essentially Claudia's replacement. She's now partnered with Scythe Master and Cal the Third Phantom. She carries on in this role until the Japan arc, when Cal finally breaks Lizzie's will to go on. As someone steeped in blood and seeing senseless violence for what it is, Lizzie has, since Claudia's death, grown less and less willing and able to reel Cal in or perpetuate the cycle of violence that everyone here is caught up in. She tries to talk Cal out of her revenge fixation, in fact, seeing how well that went for Claudia. Now she does fail at this though, and Cal does go rogue. And while capable of still using words, Lizzie finally finds her gun too heavy to actually use anymore. She thus accepts her fate as Cal shoots her down, and finally stops her bleeding heart that's been bleeding ever since Claudia's death. Lizzie's blunt honesty and open expression to her feelings are above all things refreshing. She always speaks her mind, and it's usually to express something either practically relevant or at the very least justifiable and relatable. I have spoken many times on the empathetic power possessed by supporting anime characters who are just some person, and Lizzie is the embodiment of that here. She has emotions, but she isn't controlled by them. She has opinions, but she's willing to work regardless of these and even adjust them if she sees reason to. She commits sins, but does this out of obligation to Claudia, and later her own life, neither enjoying them or dwelling on them. She works in a violent field, but understands that violence in and of itself is bad. She isn't just a muscle with a gun, but a fully realized person here, who in an attempt to simply help her friend, becomes engulfed in a world she can't hope to escape. She is refreshingly average in a series full of the extremes we see here, and above all, the characters, she's the one that can best be defined by her heart. This is because of all the supporting characters here, she's the only one without an all-consuming selfish motivation. She's not out for revenge like Claudia or Cal. She's not out for insane amounts of power or money like, say, McGuire, and she's not out to simply feed some kind of evil impulse like Scythe Master. No, instead, she's probably the only one here that had some kind of arguably noble goal here, as she simply joined to help her friend Claudia, even if it is to help Claudia's revenge quest. The two knew each other for many years before the start of the series, and while we don't see a lot of their time in this early pre-series era, it is enough to know that the two are friends, and that Lizzie's just the kind of person who will ride or die with her best friend. Now, none of this is to dismiss Lizzie's subtle but well-crafted character arc. You see, Lizzie is defined by her heart, manifesting as her close personal loyalty to Claudia, although the series does a good job of making sure that this does not equate to her actually being defined by Claudia. The two stick together through thick and thin, and while Lizzie does question Claudia's planning skills and ambitions, her personal care and love for Claudia override any logical concerns she voices. As the only one here without an all-consuming motivation like revenge or power, Lizzie is uniquely qualified to do all of this questioning, and seeing someone do it is pretty satisfying, in fact. It means we know that Lizzie is not just some blind lackey or self-interested psychopath, but a real person genuinely interested in the well-being of her friend, something which is pretty hard to find in this series. And really, the well-being of her friend is all she wanted. It's why she actively advises Claudia to walk away, or at least moderate her ambitions and actions. It's why she accepts lines that she knows are lies, and it's what makes Claudia's fall hurt even more. As while this turn of events was predictable, at least to Lizzie, that doesn't lessen its emotional impact. She's been led astray by both her best friend and her desire to help that friend. And I gotta say, that probably hurts a lot, especially knowing that this was to some extent inevitable. Lizzie wants closure, but seeing as that this is an instance of betrayal in Inferno, all she gets is an order to liquidate Claudia. someone she still loves. While this does arguably bring some kind of closure, it also obviously brings pain to Lizzie and greatly scars her, stripping her of any real reason to carry on with Inferno and her main motivation. Now, following Inferno and committing to a life of crime was something done at the insistence of her former friend, and without that friend, Lizzie now feels empty. There is no longer the big scheme or goal to be reached, just mindless violent missions assigned to her by McGuire and supervised by Scythe Master, men she both loathes. There's just a void in this human heart of hers, one that without the big goal of Claudia's slowly starts to lose all of its drive. One that is still capable of recognizing the pain around her though, and one which is still capable of recognizing that she's not really doing anything constructive in her role as an Inferno middle management. None of this was ever fun for her, and now without Claudia, and without the people she cares about, it's also pointless to her. Unlike her superiors, she has no interest in all of this violence or even the money or the power, and she's actually capable of seeing the cycle of violence for what it is, and this is why she can't pull the trigger on Cal. She knows that all the violence and evil committed here is senseless and destructive, and she simply doesn't have the heart for it anymore. And that gets us to the conclusion of the retrospective for Requiem for Phantom. Now, I do apologize about the short length of this video, by my standards at least, but I do feel that it's right, as Requiem for Phantom is one of the most haunting pieces that I've ever seen, and one of the most disturbing, if I'm being honest. I don't really recommend watching it, if I'm being honest, because it feels genuinely transgressive and disturbing. It feels ephemeral, and it is truly something that needs to be seen to be experienced. Now, if that sounds like something that interests you or wouldn't scar you, then go ahead and watch it. I'm just saying that it wasn't the show for me, as a lot of the core of this series is built upon this ephemeral and disturbing nature. I mean, pontificating about themes and characters, while relevant, is not the same as simply watching this series. It's disturbing, it's grim, it has uplifting elements and moments, but above all, it's dramatic. It talks about the operatic nature of life and how dramatic things can be, and it truly lives up to these pretensions that it sets before itself. In addition, I think it should be said that Requiem for Phantom is genuinely painful to watch. It hurts seeing all the pain here, all of the evil here. It hurts seeing innocence so trampled, and it hurts knowing that all of these characters didn't quite get the happy ending we would have liked. It's a piece that pulls no punches and wants to be as blunt as possible, and it's something which genuinely got to me, getting under my skin and making me have to take a couple breaks every now and again. I want to iterate one last time that I don't think it's objectively bad, and I think that it seems to be dialed into this disturbing tone and the messages and narratives that it seeks. It's something that I can see people appreciating, not only for this, but also the bold strides it takes, and if you can, all the power to you. I simply can't though, as even if it is painful by design, that doesn't change the fact that it's painful. It's just a narrative that I simply didn't feel I was quite ready for, and I don't know if I ever will be. And if you don't think you are, and if you don't think you will be, then I don't necessarily advise you watch it. That's not to say that it's not successful at being transgressive art, or that it has no character darks or any kind of nuance to it. There is a lot of nuance to it, and there is a lot of great character moments. All of this though comes inside a very transgressive package, which, depending on the viewer of course, may or may not be acceptable. It is by design somewhat divisive and disturbing. It is by design grim and at times nihilistic. It is by design something which is going to upset some people and be extremely interesting to others. And it is by design an extremely haunting, obscure anime memory.